Welcome everybody to today's event, Indian Dance, Articulations, Tensions and Negotiations. It's great to have people with us. This is going to be a 4-hour durational conversation that's running a little bit like a kind of lab. It's an experimental lab space. ID is delighted to invite Shivaangee Agrawal and Mandeep Raikhy to be in conversation alongside a set of contributors that they've invited, and lots of other voices will probably be in the room. So we'll have contributions from Priyanka Chandrasekhar, Avni Sethi, Navtej, Johar, and Sandra Chatterjee. And this is a great, quite a new and experimental situation, really. For those of you who don't know independent dance, Independent Dance is an organization that's currently running an international festival of learning. So it's happening for 2 weeks in this period of December. And it's really looking at learning through the body in an expanded sense. So we're seeing a whole range of movement for health kind of workshops, labs that bring in visual artists and that work with the body. So really trying to think of learning through the body and all the different kind of articulations that can have. And I suppose ID has a legacy of having been a sort of pioneer in the 1990s for sort of bringing a lot of somatic practices and improvisational practices to London and bringing lots of artists from around the world that work with those kind of practices. But we're currently in a process of really sort of trying to sort of re-question and articulate what the somatic is in different parts of the world and where somatic shows up even in classical dance forms. So this is a great way to sort of, not that this conversation is going to be all about the somatic at all, but it's a great way to sort of find some intersections through these two artists that we've had some connections with over the past few years, to see what the negotiations, the kind of politics, histories, and what the things that matter, and where they're through their both these artists' practices and where they sort of show up in different voices and in different cultures. So I'll say a little bit more about how we met. But first of all, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping about what's happening in this event. So as you can see, there's a group of dancers practicing here. They're doing, this is London Adavu practitioners. They're doing an ongoing practice, and in a sense, it's to enable us to sort of really have some kind of visual, yeah, great, this is looking fantastic. Have some kind of visual reference sometimes to what we're talking about. It might be that they do things that have loads of relevance to what we're saying, or it might be completely irrelevant, but it's just going to be ongoing. They'll obviously take breaks. They're obviously just doing their thing in the studio. We will also the contributors will be happening on mostly pre-recorded. So there'll be a bit of dropping into pre-recorded videos and dropping out again into conversations. At the moment, the chat function is just so that you can ask technical questions. You'll see a window, or one of the participants is independent dance tech support. So anyone who has any struggle and they want to ask anything to independent dance, just feel free to write a question in the chat there. In terms of questions to the contributors, that will happen, I think, a little bit later. We're going to open up that as a platform later on. So there will be a chance for people to contribute and engage through questions, and those will be an invitation. We'll be inviting you to put your questions in the chat, and then they'll be fielded through to the contributors, to Mandeep and Shivaangee. The last thing to say is that, as you can see, this is being recorded. So if you can't join for the whole time, just know that you will be able to sort of revisit it at another time. It will be recorded and put as a piece of archive on ID's digital library, which is an open source for all the sort of talk events and research that happens here. And it will probably be ready sort of after Christmas to be able to look at that. It might be edited slightly, but you'll get the highlights, and you will also get the video contributions there as well. So you'll be able to sort of see anything that you've missed. Great. So first of all, I just wanted to introduce both of our speakers a little bit more. So Mandeep, first maybe you. So Mandeep has known ID for actually quite a long time. You were in contact a lot with Kirsty Alexander, who was co-director of ID before myself. There's already been a project reimagining India that ID did with you at Gatti. So there's been a sort of long history. I actually have to say that Mandeep was one of my students when I used to teach at Larwin, so there's even more of a long history there. And I was invited by Mandeep to, in the pandemic, I led an online module. We can say a bit more about that. But so we basically is to say that we've been in conversation for quite some time around my interest in the sort of devotional aspects of the classical forms in Indian dance. Also my interest in things that I don't really know about it as well. I found yeah, and I was particularly interested in, Mandeep, you can introduce this yourself, but your notion of querying the artifact and how you do and don't use sort of archive traditional practices and take them on and create new forms. So perhaps you want to say a bit more about that. I'll hand over to you, Mandeep.
Thank you, Henny, and thank you for having me here. I'll probably talk a little bit about my practice a little bit later, but I just wanted to add to what you've already saying that when last year we began to speak about the possibility of setting up a kind of dialogue between practitioners in the UK and India, I kind of got really excited about that. And this is kind of coming from that first conversation that we had last year, where I think the excitement for me was to gauge how different geographical contexts frame geographical and political contexts in both these countries frame the practice of several of these classical dance forms. And I've even with my through my initial conversations with Shivaangee, it was quite clear that we were looking at things in contradictions many of the times, that we were both seeing the same practice very differently because of the kind of lens we were bringing to the practice, and this difference in a sense kind of became a driving force for the way that this session is envisioned, and we're hoping that we will disagree more than we agree. But it's sort of I'm really excited to be here, and Shivaangee, I'm also really excited to have this conversation with you, and I think this is the first time I'm setting up something like this, which is a conversation over 4 hours. So let's see how that pans out.
Thanks, Mandeep. And I don't know, it's probably important to say that you're in Delhi at the moment. I am here in London at Siobhan Davis Studios. The dancers are upstairs, also at Siobhan Davis Studios, and Shivaangee, you're downstairs at Siobhan Davis Studios. So we're in separate rooms, but in the same building, and we're all in London. And I've got a feeling there's a lot of people from all over the place here. So it's good to sort of locate ourselves a bit. So coming back to independent dance and Siobhan Davis Studios, I think I've known Shivaangee through several iterations. I think your initial relationship was through Siobhan Davis Studios when you were a participant of Next Choreography and one of the young artist collectives. And then also more recently, we've invited you to lead morning class in the context of independent dance, which is quite a kind of open practice space. It's like a daily practice that we run, and we don't run it every single day of the year, but it runs for about 30 weeks of the year, where between 10 and 12, a different teacher each week comes to lead a daily practice class. And more recently, that practice has been very driven by whatever artist questions are coming up at the time. So there isn't really a strict form. I think people are very open to new ideas, to improvisation, to learning new things. And so it was a great space to kind of meet your practice at that stage. And I was happy to come and do some of that work with you. So that's a little bit of an introduction to you, Shivaangee, but why don't you say a bit more about that, or whatever you want to say.
Thanks, Henny, for inviting me to be part of this dialogue with Mandeep. It's been, already a very generative dialogue and a very generative relationship. And I think that's the reason why, the biggest reason I'm really excited to be here is bringing our separate questions and inquiries and doubts and tanglements and seeing what is generated from it. And so thank you both for kind of like holding space for me as well. And I'm super excited that there's an audio session happening upstairs. I can like feel the reverberations 2 floors down as they're stamping. So that's just really exciting to have a sort of live ongoing thing. The thing that we're talking about is also happening live in front of us. So thanks, Henny, for enabling this random dream I had to actually take place. I think I might just jump straight into my introduction, if that's good with both of you guys. So Mandeep and I are just going to speak a little bit about our practices and give everyone here a bit of context as to where we're approaching this discussion from. What is our positionality? What is our subjectivity in this discussion? What are our practices? And I think we were both keen, actually, Mandeep and I, to put a disclaimer out here that we are not trying to be conclusive or comprehensive in any way about Indian dance. We are bringing to idiosyncratic practices, and we are just bringing simply our personal inquiries about Indian dance and our relationships with it and seeing where that leads us. I think that's right, Mandeep. I think that's fine for me to paraphrase. So I'm just going to jump into a bit about me and my practice. And hopefully through this little bit, I can also start to introduce some of the themes that we're going to be encountering in our event, in our discussion. So I'm going to speak about, in response to this question of how do I encounter Bharatnatyam or Indian classical dance in my practice. So it's cyclical. I turn towards Bharatnatyam, I turn away from it. It was my starting point into professional dance. So I trained at the Bharatiya Vidya Bhavan in London under Guru Prakash Yadagode through childhood and young adulthood. And then back in 2015, I spent a year in Bangalore, becoming familiar with Bharatnatyam in the geographically Indian context and training with Rukmini Vijayakumar. I moved back to London, and alongside a postgrad part-time diploma at Trinity Laban Conservatoire of Music and Dance, I found myself taking classes with or being part of rehearsal processes with the usual suspects in the UK scene. So Sita Patel, Sonia Sabri, Mayuri Boonam, Nina Rajarani, Shane Shambhu, Stella Sabaya, Subha Subramaniam, Maven Koo. So I feel like I've traversed the scene a little bit. And I'm sure there are traditionalists everywhere frowning upon this guru-less infidelity. And maybe we can touch upon that later in the discussion. I would love to have a guru. I just want to say, I think, for the consistency, for the faith in me, for the encouragement, for the security, but I also think there's a reason that I don't have one. And that is because I'm developing a practice that doesn't revolve around Bharatnatyam, but my practice is one where Bharatnatyam revolves around me as one of my many moons that I am in orbit with. And yes, I'm at the center of this orbit. My practice is about what I want to discover. It is increasingly led by my intuition as my compass. But as the form in which I have the most formal training, Bharatnatyam offers me a unique embodied experience. It's one where I'm able to coax my body into details, to be, in dialogue with my body about the details of movement and, what it feels like to change the way I move, to edit my pathways and patterns, to create new neural pathways in my limbs and my brain, to sharpen up my grasp of movement, albeit within a really specific aesthetic framework that is Bharatnatyam. And of all the things that I practice and engage in, it offers me the greatest sense of physical satisfaction. Each time I'm able to slot into and inhabit a microbeat properly, it's like reaching an itch and being able to scratch it. And I'm going to be deliberately irreverent in my choice of metaphors and imagery with which to describe my relationship with Bharatnatyam, because I'm a little bit bored and sick of the way that we talk about Indian classical dance, the superlatives, the faked religiosity, the morality, the unhumble humility. I love Bharatnatyam like I love cheese. I'm never going to give it up. I'm going to keep coming back to it. I like sharing it with people. In certain seasons, I'm addicted to it. I like connecting with other people over it. I endeavor to keep refining my palette so it's more and more tasteful, and keep discovering more and more nuanced versions of it throughout my life. And there are types of it that make me go, I can find myself being really critical of it, and it can smell really bad. And I'm going to thank Sandra, who's one of our contributors, who's going to come later, whose work on smell and metaphors about smell has given me a metaphor that I love. But yeah, Bharatnatyam can smell of oppression, casteism, capitalism, Orientalism, nationalism, and our guests are going to delve a little bit further into some of these things. So I'm just going to give you another visual while I speak, so that I can talk a little bit about where I've been in my orbit with Bharatnatyam. Hopefully this works. It's on mute. Okay, so early in my orbit with Bharatnatyam, I was most interested in mining the form for new vocabularies, in what's revealed by deconstructing it, what it contains in the way of contemporary inquiries in movement. Here's a video of me and Swati. We had a weekly sort of choreographic inquiry session with Bharatnatyam. Like perhaps most, if not all, younger and older practitioners of Bharatnatyam in the UK, I was keen to delve deeper into what I knew about this form to create new work. Here's a little clip of maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Armed with choreological training from Trinity Laban Conservatoire, deconstructing and reconstructing the patterns that I was familiar with felt really rich and revealing. And so keen to find people and peers to work with in these experiments, I co-led the creation of Rerouted Dance Collective, along with Swati Seshadri, Barbati Chaudhry, Elena Catalano, Pallavi Basak, and Meera Patel. We helped each other through the choreographic curiosities we had. We advocated for peer support and knowledge sharing as resistance to the hierarchical spaces we otherwise found ourselves practicing and dancing and maybe not experimenting in. This is Elena, who's working through something in Odyssey. This recording from a really long time ago. So the early things that I created as a new maker were a real mishmash of inquiries, manifestations of multiple desires. The desire to create, the desire to dance, the desire to discover something new. And at that time, I think what felt most urgent to me was the desire to find a personal connection to Bharatnatyam, to make it my own in a way that it felt close to me and accessible to my body. And looking back at it now, I can see, though, that it was also very much about the desire to have an inquiry and have something to apply for funding with. The desire to be able to survive and continue as a freelance dance artist in the UK. So I can't really talk about the orbit that I'm in with Bharatnatyam without talking about the universe that this orbit exists in, which is the publicly funded contemporary dancescape of the UK. And now that my practice has matured a little, I can say with greater awareness and hindsight that the UK dancescape doesn't really let you just be a dancer or a maker if you come from the land of Bharatnatyam, Kathak, Kuchipudi, Odissi, etc. While contemporary dance like falsely and deceptively positions itself as a neutral space of moving and creating, devoid of ideology or cultural specificity or aesthetic, dancers from traditional Indian backgrounds come heavy with a movement identity that functions almost like a racial or cultural identity, something that you can't shake off, something that you're stuck with in the hegemonic gaze, something that people have stereotypes and expectations for, and especially in the UK, something which all the white people around you want to celebrate for diversity reasons. And as with the pitfalls of multiculturalism, there are some huge pitfalls here. White contemporary dancers mature with the confidence that they can make anything that they're interested in, whereas Bharatanatyam dancers mature with the expectation that they will make Bharatanatyam, or at least something Indian, or at least something that looks or feels or sounds Indian to the white director of the organization that is funding your work. And this isn't a huge problem for many practitioners, I think, because they are indeed shouting about the Indianness of their work. But for me, and perhaps lots of younger creatives or future creatives to be, it takes a hell of a lot longer with a lot more resistance and persistence to find your actual creative voice and therefore make work that's any good. And as I'm speaking, I can hear the voices of my Indian peers like ringing in my ears. And they're saying, yes, but you have funding. That's amazing. We have nothing here. Or the voices of those outside the UK generally saying, it's amazing that these conversations are happening in the UK. It's so much further ahead than here. The fact that you're even able to talk about racism and whiteness in the dance space is amazing. To which I feel like saying, yes, the situation here is privileged in ways that it's not in other places. But for me, that doesn't feel like a reason to be complacent with what still doesn't feel right. And for me, I think all of this activism and all of this resistance is ultimately just about dignity. It's about having the dignity to self-determine your identity, what your capacity is, what your interests are, what your future holds, to the same degree that other people, or in this context, my white contemporary dance peers, are able. And it's about creating that dignity so that it's a reality for other people and the people that are yet to come. So it's just my luck that I've come out of these early years with the conclusion that I have very little interest in creating Bharatanatyam work. Maybe I'll come back to this a bit later, but I'd like to show you a little bit of what I am working on. Screen share moment number 2. Fingers crossed, does it work? Yes, it works. Okay. Here's a clip from a few years ago. It's a work called North, where I was interested in creating a new codified movement vocabulary that couldn't necessarily be traced back to a cultural identity. And this clip is a part that we nicknamed Lostness. I should say actually that speaker view is probably the best view to enjoy what we're doing if you haven't already figured that out. Okay, I'm going to pause. So since then, and for the past couple of years, I've been really addicted to the challenge of expressing disorientation in dance and performance. I know exactly what disorientation feels like. It is perhaps number one on my most felt feelings in life, and I feel this persistent need to find a way of expressing it or recreating it through dance. I haven't quite figured it out yet, but this year has been really fruitful for my research as I've been able to take some of my experiments to lots and lots of different dance spaces. So here's a quick peek at where I am at with this. This is something that my collaborators and I call our disorientation practice. So when I say disorientation, I'm talking about feeling suspended between different grounds, different groundings, being suspended in confusion, in not knowing, in not being able to grasp. And I think it's a feeling that manifests often, but I think one that we all have different ways of managing, navigating, ignoring, or maybe suppressing. And by turning the experience of disorientation into a practice, by which I mean something where it's deliberate, it's embraced, it's ongoing, it's playful, I'm finding that something that's otherwise incredibly uncomfortable and scary can feel a lot more palatable when we engage with it with intention. So I'm obsessed with this orientation because I feel like it explains my experiences of being in communities, whether it's a Bharatnatyam community or a diasporic community or my family. And I think the experience of collectivity necessarily contains disorientation, as suddenly our individual agency is interacting with the agency of the group. But specifically, disorientation feels linked to the loss of autonomy, a helplessness or a powerlessness. And my relationship with Bharatnatyam, to orbit that, is endlessly disorientating. It's a relating that doesn't adhere to the binary of loving it or leaving it. It's a relating where I'm not trying to mine Bharatnatyam for anything. It's a relating where I'm not training in Bharatnatyam for visibility or for prestige. It's a relating where I'm uncomfortable with lots of things in it, especially the way that it's transmitted. It's a relating that feels quite cautious, to be honest, and I've always been really frustrated by the distance that exists between Bharatnatyam and me as a result. This distance it feels like a sort of uphill pilgrimage that I have to undertake to reach the form, and each time I enter the studio. And I'm envious of those who can just step into Bharatnatyam without a glance, as if it's just simply another skin, the next breath. And I think about where this distance comes from, this distance between me and the form, and lots of different suggestions pop up. Is it a North Indian, South Indian cultural divide that sort of lives in my cells? Is there a much more conscious reluctance that I maintain towards physical pain and discomfort? Is it a hypersensitivity that I have to wrongness or incorrectness or messiness? Is it about how I've divided my attention between different disciplines? And the answer to these questions has always been that regular committed training and practice, riyaz, sadhana, is the way to overcome this distance. It's just about committing and investing time into it. And that's what all the greats say. That's what Instagram, #practice_everyday says. But increasingly, I've been wondering whether the distance doesn't just come from the fact that Bharatnatyam comes with a lot of heavy, unvoiced, invisible baggage that I'm not really engaging with. In the studio, in Adabu practice, we don't really acknowledge the colonial legacy that sits very peacefully inside this aesthetic. The cleansing, by which I mean erasure, that this form simultaneously hides and celebrates. And right now, for me, the capitalist underpinnings of how we relate to Bharatnatyam. In training, in spending hours every day or every other day, even practicing adabus, practicing technique, repertoire, we are essentially spending our time and labor, so money, in order to buy the currency of perfection, of mastery, basically to be admitted into the elusive and exclusive inner circle of those who are excellent at it. But to what end? The notion of being excellent or being perfect is by definition being above average, which by definition means better than those around you. The imperative to endlessly practice through your life feels like a way to gatekeep the form and legitimacy within the form for those who have the highest amount of currency, which in this case is time and money, to spend investing in the form. And I'm not sure if I'm making a very persuasive point, and I'm making some big oversimplifications here. And I'm still trying to untangle it myself, but I feel like there is something sinister or insidious about the way that we are taught to devote ourselves to practice. I teach an adults class of Bharatnatyam in London for a contemporary dance organization for the place. And in small but meaningful ways, I'm finding small and meaningful ways to resist this sort of labor-intensive or time-intensive cost of admission to Bharatnatyam. There are things that we can do with the body that don't simply rely on repetition. And I think where I'm coming to now at the end of this bit about my practice is, where does Bharatnatyam end and where does pedagogy begin? What is that delineation? Where exactly on that delineation do the problems lie? I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for listening. And I feel really excited that I've been given an opportunity to voice my doubts and my reservations in a space that I believe is going to be really generative. I've already learned so much just from watching the videos come in, and I'm really excited with Mandeep to share that with everybody. So enough. I'm going to pass on to Mandeep and understand a little bit more about where you're coming from. You're on mute.
Oh, yeah, but it just told me that I can't unmute myself, and then I could suddenly. Thank you, Shivaangee. That gives me clarity on your practice, and it's amazing actually that we're, in a sense, really getting to know each other's practice fully, really, in the presence of other people as witnesses, and I find that a kind of exciting kind of setup. So maybe I'm going to quickly give you a sense of my practice, but starting maybe really far back from when I knew Henny as a student at Laban, which was in 2002. So I started as with jazz in Delhi. That's how I started dancing in 1999. And soon enough, in the next couple of years, I knew what I was interested in was contemporary dance, and I was interested in the way contemporary, or at least the engagements that I had with contemporary dance, the way it seemed to engage the body and the mind. And what that interest took me to was to enroll myself on a course at Laban. I did a BA at Laban. And fast forward 3 years, I find myself sort of beginning to move like everyone else. So there was this moment that many of us had, and we were from different parts of the world, that we were beginning to really move like each other. And in a sense, I mean, it dawned on me that we were all moving like white people. You know, that's the sense that I got. And I think for the first time, I got this sense that there was something that Indianness had to propose to me, that there was something about Indianness that I needed to sort of assert for the first time. And it was something that it was part of my identity I didn't need to assert in India. And soon enough, in this sort of conversation or this sort of pursuit for Indianness in the third year of Laban, I came across Shobna Jaisingh's work. I watched Flicker in the theater, and I was very, very charmed by the fact that it drew from Bharatnatyam, but it was immediately transformed. You know, it didn't ever get into the form to a point where, you know, you had street gestures entering the form, and you had a kind of like a it's almost as if the vocabulary of Bharatnatyam had been electrocuted with some urban energy. Especially Flicker was one of those works where it really looked like it had been, dancers' bodies had been electrocuted. And so I auditioned for the company, and I got through, and I worked with Shobna for 5 years. And during those 5 years, that's the first time I actually started training in Bharatnatyam. And of course, you know, the ironic thing is that Bharatnatyam gets you before any other form. You know, maybe we talk a little bit more about the Bharatnatyam hegemony, but you know, that's the form that sort of finds you before anything else does. Not sure why that is, but I think I have a sense of how in India, it was one of the first forms that could easily be co-opted into the new nation's self-image. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but what was exciting about the way I received Bharatnatyam was that I learned it in the morning, and we were already breaking it down in the afternoons. And I found it exciting as a process of learning the form, because it was a playful process right from the beginning. That there wasn't a kind of, I didn't receive it with reverence. I didn't receive it with an attention to any kind of wholeness, that I had to learn something that was whole, and then, you know, I had to learn every part of it. But we were learning bits and bobs of it, and we were already breaking them down in the afternoon. And I found that, I think in a way for me, it also liberated me from having to unlearn anything, because I didn't really learn anything, I think, because I was already breaking it down. But 5 years of working with Shobna's company, I also realized that I was beginning to experience difficulties with the work. I was beginning to see how harsh it was on the body, for one. And I knew that there was a kind of assertion that the body had, was to do with performing one's Indian identity in a space, in a kind of multicultural space like London. And I felt tired performing Shobna's work. And I realized that actually it wasn't my fight. In 5 years, when I was then beginning to also articulate my own choreographic questions by then, I realized that her questions were different from mine, that I needed to not, and by this time I'd already done a few applications to the Arts Council, and I knew very quickly that one had to play up the Indian card to get, to get funding. And I was deeply uncomfortable with that, because I felt that this playing up of my Indian identity was not something I've wanted to do for long. I felt like I wanted to be home where the question of Indianness didn't matter to me anymore. I was really sort of craving to go back into that space where I didn't have to perform my Indian identity at all times. And sure enough, when I head back, I begin to sort of realize, if I were to make work, what would the work be like? And of course, the first work that I made, Inhabited Geometry, was really a way for me to digest this experience with Shobna, also to think about how I would do it differently. If I were to do it differently, what would I do? There was also this dilemma of, if I were to make work, I don't want to make work with vocabulary that I had inhabited at Laban. I didn't want to be in India moving like everyone else at Laban. So this question of, is it possible for me to then give myself the license to work with the vocabulary of Bharatnatyam? Find a sense of home in its vocabulary, as I was finding home again back in Delhi, 7 years of being away from Delhi. This question of home became quite important to me. And I realized that there was a lot of fear that I encountered in being able to say, okay, I give myself the license to work with the vocabulary of Bharatnatyam, even though I have not learned it in the way that you're meant to learn it. I know bits and bobs of it. I'm interested in its geometry, but do I really have the permission to? But then whose permission, really? So I gave myself that permission, and I'm going to share screen just so that I can show, you don't have to see my face, and we can see clips of the work as I speak through it. So Inhabited Geometry was a way for me to ask myself this question, that is it possible for me to inhabit the vocabulary of Bharatnatyam? Is it possible for me to look at the question of home through the geometry of Bharatnatyam? So if we were to really, so what I was charmed by was Bachelard's Poetics of Space, where he articulates that an architectural space is only a cardinal space unless you infuse memories and associations into it. So I began to sort of look at Bharatnatyam as that kind of an architectural space, and see whether one could infuse its geometry with with one's own memories, with associations, looking at ways in which one's own body could find shortcuts and find new pathways that were to do with one's own findings. So that's how this work came about. So in a sense, what I'd put into space was the question of geometry and the question of home. The work is now about 12 years old, and it feels like another time. And I think for me, the work was a way to also sort of put behind me this question of and home and identity, especially a national identity, being of resolving my identity as Indian. And through the next decade, I began to sort of look at ways in which the moving body could pose questions around constructs of gender, sexuality, religion, and particularly the secular. How does the moving body invoke the secular? And I want to maybe jump literally 12 years ahead and talk about the work that I'm beginning to imagine now, because I feel like 12 years on, I'm beginning to work again with classical dance material. So the work that I'm looking at now centers itself around the image of the Tribhanga. I'm going to just take us into a kind of rehearsal video of this new work. So as India celebrates its 75th year of independence, I see also this as an occasion to look back, perhaps at some of the forces that propelled Indian classical dance into the trajectories that it has taken. So I have a kind of a growing curiosity that how the kind of religious and caste-based erasure in the 20th century history of Indian dance, how did it face up with Article 15 of the Constitution of India, which prohibits any discrimination on grounds of religion, race, caste, sex, or place of birth. I find that contradiction really kind of key in understanding how dance in India has perhaps insidiously bypassed the country's constitutional commitments. Where at one level, the Constitution of India was being set up to protect its minorities. And at the same time, the dance of the country was being reorganized as a kind of upper caste, upper class Hindu cultural practice. So I look at the image of the Tribhanga as a kind of starting point for a choreographic exploration. Tribhanga is a standing body position used in traditional Indian art and classical dance forms like Odissi, where the body bends in one direction at the knees, the other direction at the hips, and then the other direction at the shoulders and the neck. So it's got this kind of three-part brokenness to it. What I find interesting with the history of the Tribhanga is that the first evidence of it is in the Dancing Girl, which is a small statue that belongs to 2300 BC to 2000 BC. And what is exciting is that this statue, which now sits at the National Museum in Delhi, is a highly contested image. So we had Pakistan sort of coming up and saying, actually, this belongs to Pakistan because it was discovered in what is now part of Pakistan. It had the Hindu right wing claiming that it is actually goddess Parvati. It also has people sort of saying that actually this is not a dancing girl at all. Maybe it's just been wrongly titled. This is just a girl who's standing with a pestle and grinding something. So there were all these contestations, and I find it really exciting that something as simple as an artifact like the Tribhanga has so many different kinds of contestations. It has passed from one religion to another. It has passed from one dance form to another, from one sculptor to another. And I'm beginning to sort of look at how one could look at this image and continue to reimagine a new dance. Is it possible for us to perhaps look at this quintessential image of the ancient Indian dancing body and see whether it can live, breathe, evolve, transform through the body, through our bodies, the moving bodies of dancers? I'm also interested in looking at perhaps one part of Odissi, which is the Tribhanga, and see if one could study one part, which is the Tribhanga, and imagine the whole. How does one study a part through a simultaneous process of reconstruction and demolition? Yeah, I want to stop there because I can go on and on, but what I'm also interested in with this project, lastly, is the question of what the value of queering the artifact could propose to us. If the question of queering, what that opens up for us is a way to live outside the system of binaries, where the self, in a sense, is always in the process of becoming. Does the question of queering then allow us to embrace the process of blurring, erasing, and transforming? Through this interplay between the queer and the artifact, I'm interested in examining perhaps the transgressive possibilities that the queer lens can unleash on the Indian dancing body. Could the process of queering Indian dance become a tool, perhaps, for us to push back at the political wave of Hindu nationalism that is currently sweeping India? Can the body of the nation on its 75th birthday be imagined as this ever-evolving Tribhanga?
Wow. Thank you, Mandeep.
Thank you.
Thank you both. I want to thank you both for the sort of transparency that you've revealed about the multiple forces that affect you as practitioners, both from the political, both from the geographical where you're based, funding opportunities. It's so complex how you've managed to sort of articulate the worlds you're navigating. So it's actually leaving us with a huge amount of sort of food for thought, and I'm quite sort of acrobatic almost in the way that I've been listening to you. I'm sure you both have questions for each other, so we're going to move into a little bit of that, a kind of dialogue for each other. I don't really think I need to, I just wanted to, some of the things that really struck me are this insidiousness or some sort of insipid that seems to be operating in both your experience of your culture, Mandeep, the kind of caste system insidiousness and the sort of political oppression that happens through a dance form. But it was equally, you talked about this sort of insipid, everyone moving the same at Laban as well. And so there's and I think you touched on some of these things. So I'm just really curious about trying to understand how, so this transparency that you're both bringing, but it's also like why so much unmasking needs to happen, how things get so masked and sort of stuck in sort of insidious places where it's all a bit lots of assumptions, that things aren't really talked about, things become a sort of assumed. So that was, it's not, you don't have to respond to that question now, but I was just throwing that in, but I think you both probably have loads to say as responses to each other first.
Yeah, I'm also just taking a moment to process. I feel like lots of stuff has been brought into this space, and yeah, just processing this, yeah, so much here. Yeah, I guess some of the things I'm curious about, Mandeep, when you were speaking, is this, I found this really interesting, this idea of wanting to go back home so that you can stop having to perform your identity. And yeah, something that I can't relate to, like, as in I can relate to it, but I'm just like, wait, what does that feel like? What does it feel like to go home so that you don't have to perform your identity? And I feel like I don't actually have a geographical or otherwise like space like that. Because yeah, feels like growing up here and functioning here, it's so inevitable. I don't even know what that feels like to be. I guess I know what that feels like to be when I'm around people who are also going through the same things. I guess around like non-white spaces, often that's like the comfort of being in non-white spaces, is this pressure to perform your identity. This very subtle pressure to perform your identity isn't there. But I'm just, yeah, this idea of like going back to a home or a country where that isn't there is fascinating. And this, I thought it was quite interesting that Bharatnatyam, that you brought Bharatnatyam into your experiments and questions back in India after this pressure had gone, which I found quite interesting. So that kind of interesting oppositional relationship that we maybe have with regards to Bharatnatyam. Sorry, I like trying not to waffle, but also live thoughts. And yeah, really interested in this idea of sort of recreating something from artifact and yeah, reconstructing something, which is funny because I feel like I usually encounter the word like reconstruction in a very sort of loaded sense when it comes to Indian dance, because what we now understand as Indian classical dance is, you know, so like reconstructed in quite a contrived way post-independence for a very specific agenda, post-colonial national identity agenda, very different from what came before, big breaks in history and aesthetic and intention and experience of the form, which is usually what I associate with reconstruction. And hearing you talk about sort of reconstructing a form from the Tribanga, from this model, is, yeah, really, I'd be curious to hear a little bit more about how that works for you, how your relationship to reconstruction is as well. Okay, yeah, I'm going to give you space now to speak.
Yeah, I'm actually really wary of using the word reconstruction, because it is loaded, especially with the history of Bharatnatyam. And I think in my kind of looking at the history of Odissi, I began to draw some lessons from that, actually. And lessons were really that that far from being a kind of ancient dance form, Odissi stemmed really from a set of choices that a loose association of people made in the 1950s. And it was an immensely imaginative process. Having spoken to a few people who've been closely studying that moment of Odissi coming into being, it was creative because a lot of choices were made in a room full of people, where they chose to link this new form that they wanted to create to already ancient Sanskrit texts such as Natya Shastra and Abhinay Darpana. They also took inspiration from folk forms like Mari and Gotipua. And in this whole process of reinvention, the group also took inspiration from Bharatnatyam's casteist, elitist model of reformation that had taken place a few decades ago. So it became a kind of model form that one could sort of borrow processes of reconstruction from. So this process of reinventing a form was also shaped very much by the intention to codify this vocabulary as soon as it is made, to seek classical status and to safeguard the purity of its style, and definitely its allegiance to Hindu cultural identity. And I think the only thing that I really sort of draw of value from this history is how creative this process was. It was really sort of like, it was this form, what we're made to imagine it is being handed down by the gods, but actually, or that this form is about 4,500 years old, but actually it was a deliberate construction by a group of human beings through very considered political choices in the middle of the 20th century. And I find that if it is all made up, then how do I make up forms today? How do I make choices about making up forms today from one element? And what kind of informed choices can I make today in 2022? And in 2022, where we are in the middle of a kind of Hindu right-wing regime in power in India, that is pushing forth a kind of Hindu identity on the nation. How do the politics of these times then inform the making of a new form? Is a question that I'm asking myself. So yeah, I would shy away from the word reconstruction.
Yeah, I mean, from what you're saying, I'm going to offer that what you're doing is a speculative practice. We love the word speculative, especially in like literature. And I feel like, yeah, it's funny. It's funny how close the worlds of speculation and reconstruction are. But yeah, I mean, yeah, I didn't want to sort of impose, obviously, a judgment on what you're doing. But yeah, it is very interesting that these processes are so linked.
In fact, the current working title for this work is Hallucinations of an Artifact. And I'm sort of landing there because there's something about hallucinations is kind of, it's unexpected, it's playful, it's you're also sort of imagining into the future, you're kind of disoriented in terms of time, and linearity is in a sense sort of suspended. So yeah, I'm kind of going with the word hallucinations because there's something
and actually, as you're speaking, I'm feeling that really the whole of the problematic with reconstruction actually just lies in the right? It's just in the bit of the reconstruction. There's nothing inherently problematic maybe about construction, but there's something very inherently problematic about reconstruction because you're asserting a historical narrative, or you're asserting history, or like, this is what history is, we're returning to what was, and that's like where the problematic begins of like, well, actually what was, and what are you saying what was. So, and also the biggest thing about reconstruction is the disenfranchising the hereditary community from their own cultural practice. And I think that it's really this question of, I keep asking myself this question of, in kind of hallucinating through this artifact, I'm very mindful, am I at any point treading on someone else's dance, or taking away from someone else's practice? And I think for me, that's really important, that one's dance doesn't invalidate anyone else's. And I think that's really where I want to rest with this work. Yeah, and maybe it's worth, we were going to also acknowledge, Mandeep, right here about this event today, that the erasure that you're speaking about with regards to hereditary communities in India at the time of the reconstruction of Indian dance, that erasure is still, very much continuing, ongoing. And this event in itself is also a microcosm of that erasure, because we acknowledge who is here and who is not. And I think for me, in sort of looking at inviting these contributions, it was, for me, it was the most important thing was to bring in a voice from the hereditary community to be able to speak about. And I think, and I realized that it's a difficult thing. The forces of that brutal erasure
are still at play. And it's not easy to find people who will have the voice to articulate a contribution like this. Yeah.
And I think that kind of question of erasure and access, maybe in a slightly different way, definitely in a slightly different way, is, you know, still a very relevant one in the UK context of when we talk about platforming or raising people's voices, or creating visibility for certain types of people. It's a hugely complex endeavor. Like, how do we actually give them access to something? It's easy to send an email and invite someone to something and be like, great, I've got this voice on my panel. But what labor is there actually to make sure that they can actually be here, which is a very different thing from just having the intention to invite someone. And I think, I'm glad that we're acknowledging that. Yeah,
I'm mindful also of tokenism, of putting in one voice for the sake of it also. That actually, and I think in my conversation with Nritya Pillai, I realized when I extended an invitation to Nritya to contribute to this session, and I saw from her perspective that she didn't want to be invited to speak about her work and to do the labor of explaining the brutal history of this form, that this labor needed to be done by other people. And I think her response to me was, I would like to be invited to show the work, to show my work, to perform my politics. I don't want to speak about my politics. So I think that for me was really also a realization that I didn't see this from their perspective, that I didn't see that this is what it feels like to be invited also to sessions like this, where you feel like you're being asked to do that labor all over again and again.
And to represent, to have that burden of representing, or, you know, so the burden of representation.
So I had a question for you, Shivaangee.
Yeah.
I was, I'm very, I was thinking about what disorientation means to you in your practice and where that has really come from. And I think that I can see how, in a sense, even if the question of, or the practice of disorientation doesn't have directly to do with Bharatnatyam, but I know that it is coming from a kind of tension that you have with the form, as well as with somehow perhaps also having to perform your identity within a kind of setup like the UK. And I was actually wondering, and we kind of had a brief conversation about this when we met in London, how do you navigate the ticking of the ethnic box? Does that still exist in the UK, or do you find yourself having to play up your identity in order to access support? And if you do, then what kind of relationship do you have with that process? Because I know that kind of, I experienced that tension firsthand. So I know it exists. It existed 20 years ago, but I'm not sure what it is like now, whether that box has disappeared, or are you now able to be a choreographer, or do you still need to be an Indian choreographer?
This is a really difficult question. I guess the easy things to say are, yes, that is very much still there. And that dynamic is 100% very much existing all the time now, all the time. My work that I'm working on for disorientation, the work is called Velocities, and I've been working on it for the past 3 years, and past 2 years with a team of dancers and collaborators. And we get rejected for funding applications if we don't call it a Bharatnatyam project, which is really ironic because it's not got much to do with Bharatnatyam. But resubmitting exactly the same application with Bharatnatyam in the title gets me the funding. like literally exactly the same application. So it's still very much there. And it's a really, really bitter sort of experience. Because on the one hand, there's a privilege of getting funding, obviously, and there are so many people that are not, and the situation can feel so dire. It is so dire here in terms of how much money there is for the arts. So yeah, there's obviously like the huge privilege of someone being like, yes, this is worth funding. And there's the huge like bitterness of, I, as a brown person, am just purely ticking a box for these people. And if I try and propose a work that has got nothing to do with my brownness or nothing evident to do with my brownness, it's not worth it because, well, I could just be ticking a box instead. And so why is that? No one is incentivized to, yeah, it's like a very, and I think, yeah, it's what I was speaking about the dignity, like, after all, for like all the anti-racist stuff, all the activism stuff, for me, like, I just feel it's about dignity at the end of the day, like who gets the dignity to decide what they want to do and who they can be and who doesn't. So it's a really complicated, I have a very complicated relationship with this situation, obviously, because it's like privilege and marginalization all at the same time. And, you know, gratitude and resentment all at the same time as well. But also to say that the Arts Council is not the be all and end all of my experiences as a freelance dance artist. And, you know, there's a spectrum of like how institutionalized some spaces are. You know, like submitting an application to the Arts Council for money is like at one end of like having to be a game player and having to be a business person. There's thankfully a load of other spaces and experiences that are untangling that, unraveling that, and creating more authentic space for people to be. So I don't know, I don't want to be like massively pessimistic. That I get a lot of joy from being in London and from being in the UK dance scene, but I am, yeah, very sensitive to the way that I'm perceived and the reasons for being invited to things, the reasons that I've been asked to come and do this. You know, you have to wonder, like, is this about me or is this about an agenda? And maybe lots of people can relate to that across different marginalizations. I don't know if you got what you wanted out of that question.
Yeah. I mean, in any case, I don't think we're kind of looking for neat conclusions anyway. I think this is going to be, the conversation is going to sort of tag along in sort of several unresolved ways. And that's the excitement of a long dialogue, actually, that one could ramble on and still have witnesses. Yeah. So I'm wondering, because it's now 12:15 UK time, whether we should go to the first contribution, if you want to introduce the first one.
Does Henny want to say something, or are we going to go straight into it?
No, I'm happy. If you want to talk, I'll just set it up to give me.
Cool, yeah. So maybe I can just say, so we're going to have a contribution from Priyanka Chandrasekhar, who is a Bangalore-based Bharatnatyam practitioner. And she runs this project called Nirali. She's a younger artist, like me, sort of in the same peer group, I guess. And I was really interested in inviting her to speak because maybe unlike some of the other kind of people in my reference points and my reference map of what's happening, where I feel like she's very committed to Bharatnatyam and very committed to being inside that paradigm, while still reckoning with quite important questions around pedagogy and how she transmits the form to her students and how she speculates and constructs a different way of transmission. So yeah, I think that's enough to say. She also introduces herself, so I think we can just go straight into it.
Have you got that up on your screen just to check? Yeah.
Hello, my name is Priyanka Chandrasekhar. I'm a movement practitioner based out of Bangalore in India. I have trained in the classical dance forms of Bharatnatyam and Kathak for many years. A few years back, I started and founded a space called Nirali. Along with training in the technique of Bharatnatyam, at Nirali, we are reimagining the classical dance, Indian dance pedagogy. So it's a space which aspires to be non-hierarchical. It's a space which encourages and nurtures discussion, review, critique, expression, questions, and everything that I will be speaking to you through this video will be from my experiences of creating the space with a group of people that I work with, along with my own experiences of building the new body of work that I am making for performance. Up front, I wanted to start by talking about how, when sort of Shivaangee reached out to me and we had these discussions, I went back and thought about how some of these questions and investigations were almost inescapable for me, especially when I started to create my own body of work and when I started to enter into this role of facilitation or exchange that I do through Nirali. And I'm very curious to know how it is possible for so many dance practitioners, so many dancers to not engage in these questions. I feel like it's almost impossible to have not encountered them. So I want to also acknowledge while we are having this discussion, and I feel very, very grateful to have been included in this conversation. I also want to sort of say that there are a lot of us who aren't thinking about some of these things or who are not actively engaging with these questions. And that is something that as a community we all need to sort of reflect about. One of the main themes of this discussion, as I saw, was whether Bharatanatyam can be used to critically engage with the world around us. This has been the basis of almost all the work that I do in both my solo performance as well as at Nirali. So I feel like I want to start by talking about this. Over time, I have realized that Bharatanatyam can be a very effective tool. One, of course, I feel like the form itself allows for a lot of communication. Yes, it's codified, but there are ways in which you can break the form, you can make it malleable to say what you want to say. That has been my experience. So that's one part of it. The other part of it also, what I find interesting is there is very little suspicion associated with Bharatanatyam, be it audiences, be it organizers, even authorities. For instance, if I'm dressed like a Bharatanatyam dancer or like a Bharatanatyam teacher, I'm sure I won't get caught for, say, drunken driving. I mean, why is a separate question, and that's another problem in itself which we can also discuss and talk about. But what I'm trying to say is that it can be a very interesting tool of resistance because perhaps nobody is expecting it. So in my experience, it is a very effective way of engaging critically with the world. So many of my friends have often said that, you can't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house, because yes, Bharatanatyam does sit on a lot of oppression. It sits on the history of marginalization and erasure. But I feel like using the form, of course, changing it, breaking it, and then still using it to say what you want to say can be a very interesting form of resistance. Before I answer this question of what is form and what is pedagogy, I think it's really interesting to talk a little bit about why they are not distinct things in the Indian classical dance understanding. In my experience, it's predominantly because of this Guru Shishya Parampara that we so religiously follow in classical dance. The fact that, it has been ingrained into us, we have grown up with this idea that whatever my teacher teaches is what I have to teach. The way she teaches is how I should teach. We have very easily and comfortably become a vessel to just sort of pass on. So I think that growing up learning Bharatanatyam, pedagogy itself was never accessible to us. As a student of Bharatanatyam, I think what I accessed in my years of learning, it was only the form, only the skill, only the technique. I don't think there was an opportunity to say perhaps understand how to create, how to compose, how to choreograph, or even ask questions saying, why am I sitting in Aramandi? Why am I doing Saraswati like this? Why am I, moving so fast? I don't think there was space, or perhaps there was space, but we were sort of in a way trained not to ask. And because I never accessed pedagogy at all when I was learning Bharatnatyam, I am not too surprised that both of them seem like the same thing today, because that is what was expected out of us, that we teach what we were taught. Interestingly, I've had many conversations with my own teacher, actually disagreements with my own teacher, and I also know a friend who had a conversation with a very famous guru about how once we sort of buy the music from our teacher about of a particular composition, it is expected out of us that we perform the same choreography in the same way. And often we are told that if you want to do your own choreography, if you want to innovate and create, then you go create your own music for it. So, and these conversations are very common. So, and it's almost impossible given how the economy functions in the art space, especially in classical dance. It's almost impossible for somebody who's just starting out to create their own music. So what I'm trying to say is, because of these gatekeeping tendencies and because of this tradition where we have to follow this Guru Shishya Parampara, I don't think we access pedagogy at all, and no wonder that it both looks like the same thing. For me, after these many years of dealing with form and pedagogy, I feel like form is the gesture, the vocabulary, the aesthetic, those little principles by which we sort of identify a particular form. But for me, pedagogy has become more about how it is articulated or how it is assimilated in the body. For me, pedagogy has to be speculative. For me, it's almost impossible for it not to be. It has to be reflective, it has to be responsive, it has to be constantly changing and evolving. It has to be messy. I feel like that those are my experiences with pedagogy for now. Also, the way that we do the classes at Nirali, it's very person-centric. So a lot of the work that we have created is based on the personal stories of the students who train here. So there is no way for it not to be constantly changing from body to body. Also, when I enter a class that I want to facilitate with 5 or 6 people, of course we work with a very small group of people. When I enter a class with just sort of 5 or 6 people, I'm always thinking, what does each person need? How will each person respond? Will it push them enough, or should it not push them enough? So I'm also planning the class keeping all of these people in mind. So in my opinion, I think there is no way for pedagogy to not be speculative and confusing. I think that is how it, in my opinion, should be. It is predominantly at Nirali, and the work that I have done, it is, I'm not sure if I can call it student-led. It is student-driven for sure. Because like I said, I think about them before I enter the class, and I'm also constantly reflecting about what it did to each person and body after the class. I'm constantly asking for their feedback and reflection, and it really matters what they bring into the class, what mood they are entering into class. Like growing up, often, I've heard a lot of very senior teachers say that, leave your personal rubbish outside and then step into the dance class. But that's the opposite of what we try to create in the space, where they come in with their moods, they come in with all the baggage that they're carrying, and then we sort of do class. So then I'm still not sure if I can call it student-led, because I feel like when the class itself is happening, I'm the one sort of, the facilitator is sort of leading the exercise, but it is collaborative. And the days that I find equal collaboration are the most enriching. But it is definitely student-driven. Using everyday, normal, mundane life, which we think has really nothing to offer, has actually been very helpful for me to innovate and bring into class, and I've always found those experiences extremely interesting. Of course, intention matters a lot. I think, like for example, we do adavus for the purpose of what? Skill training, stamina, or anga shuddhi, or perfection. These are the usual intentions with which we practice nritta in Bharatnatyam. But for me to now change that intent and say, we do a small check-in in class every time everybody comes in, and we just sort of see what's in the room before we start the class. So what would it mean now that you're feeling like this? Use that feeling and let the adavu change, and then explore the adavu. Or we are embodying a leaf, and now let's change, or let's break the adavu and now explore the adavu like that. So the intention has changed. Now it is not about stamina or skill, it is about exploration, it is about play, it is about mischief. So that has been extremely helpful. Nirali started with, me saying to myself, I will not be my teacher, and I will do everything, and I will fill all those gaps that I found in my own learning of Bharatnatyam. So as a child, I would just sort of study and then go to dance class and come back home, do homework and sleep. I never really had play time. So now games are a big part of everything that we do in Nirali. And children are mostly playing, and through games we now introduce dance to them, because it's about, for me it has also been about filling those gaps and doing things that I didn't get to do. In this whole process, there are some things that have been very easy to let go of. For example, a lot of the religious aspects of the form, like having, a dance class has to look a certain way. There are paintings and there are idols. All of that has been very easy to let go of. We don't have a god. We don't start the class with a namaskaram, for instance. We don't do these rituals of respect like Vijay Dashami. We don't do Guru Dakshina. Those have been the easy things to let go of. Of course, the really uncomfortable costume, jewelry, the accessory, the ghungru, all of this we have sort of moved away from. We use it if it sort of adds value, but otherwise it has been something that we have moved past. There are other things which have been extremely difficult to let go of. For example, power. I think in creating a space like this, where I'm trying to say that the pedagogy is student driven, where the space is non-hierarchical, I have had to consciously let go of power, be in class and observe and witness and not interfere but interfere, and that has been a very difficult space, very discomforting space, and often I have come back thinking, so what is safe for me? So that has been a little difficult and challenging in creating a space like this, especially when I have changed what is familiar to me. That has been a negotiation all the time. The other thing that I feel like I have let go a little, but I still have to work on a lot more, is this idea of what is neat. In Bharatanatyam, I think it's so drilled into your head as to, you have to have those perfect lines, you have to have those perfect curves. So changing that is a little difficult. I have come some way with it, but on some days I'm able to see a very tired face and say, oh, so beautiful. I'm able to see everything as a thing of beauty, but on many days I'm still going back to that problematic idea of anga shuddhi. So that is something that has been very difficult to let go of. What I've held on to, and I want to clarify, what I mean by held on to is also different. I've held on to the form with all its elements. For example, there is Aramandi, there is gestures, there is the classifications of the Ashtanaikas, there is the Navarasa. All of that I have retained only so that I can break it or I can play with it. So this idea of holding on doesn't mean pass on or keep as is. At least for me, it has been that I keep it so that I can now play with it. Because if I don't have the rules of the game, then I don't know what to play. So I have also retained compositions. For example, I do this performance as in the solo format. A very famous Devarnama called Jagadodharana, where I have retained the text, I have retained the music, I have retained the composition, but I subvert it in performance and speak of the narrative of the ordinary child or the other child. So it is only because the form already has that am I able to critique and say another story. So that is something I have, you can say I have held on to and played with, but not held on to pass on necessarily. My entire engagement of this form of pedagogy can be summarized with one word: questions. So I think there are no answers, but there are a lot of questions, and I have with time come to really enjoy them. But to name and to sort of state a few questions that have plagued my practice, I think one very popular one is, what is the purpose of what we call pure dance or nritta, at least in the way that it was received by us, is something that I've kept going back to. Another one that I have started to think about a lot in the work that I create is, what stories can I say in my body and what stories I can't, and the problems of representation, especially given that I come from a privileged caste background. Another question that has I think stayed with me for a very long time is, what is the form and what is me? I feel like the form is so stuck in me and I'm so stuck in the form that sometimes I don't know where is me and where is the form. And I think that has been a very interesting personal question for me, which affects my dance practice a lot. So that's a question that I like to engage with, and I also like to sort of see other students engage with this, because it's very different for different people. What is rigor is something that has often come up, especially given what we see on social media, especially given the one idea of rigor, which is hours of practice, which is sweaty faces, which is about repeating. Given that, you're so bombarded with these images, how do you find the rigor that is required for your pieces, for your practice? That has been, and what is rest in the middle of rigor, and how do you negotiate rigor and rest in a practice with the body, has been something that we've been constantly exploring. Very recently, I have started to now also ask this question of, what is the relationship that the performer shares with the audience? And I saw myself asking this to a bunch of very upcoming dancers recently at an event, where I was asking them, what do you think the audience is seeing when they are seeing you? And of course, the experience can be of many things, of joy, of discomfort, of boredom. It can be all of that. But what are they actually seeing? And are we fully aware of what we are showing? And I think this relationship of seeing and experiencing is something that I'm really interested to investigate. I think the ideal world for someone like me, who is on this journey of exchange or facilitation as well as creation of new work, I think is where people are more comfortable with the idea of new, are a little less intimidated, a little less unwelcomed by the idea of something unfamiliar. I feel like even today, parents are very happy to send their children to Bharatnatyam classes where there is a uniform, where you're dressing up, or where dancers are wearing practice sari, because it's seen, it's done, they know what would come out of it. But what they don't realize is the many years that then we spend on unlearning, relearning and all of it. But I understand that anything new, any change takes time and a lot of patience. So, but for me, an ideal world would be a very excited audience who's interested in participation and not perhaps escaping from reality. And spaces that support work that is new, that encourage work that is new. Instead, especially in a field like Indian classical dance, where you're saying the same stories in the same way, wearing the same costume, there should be a lot of spaces that are interested and excited by new work, which is political, which is personal. So I think more support, and of course a sense of community and belonging, where problematically also I think it's really important to identify with a group, whether it is the Bharatnatyam group or resisting the Bharatnatyam group. I think it's really important to feel a sense of community, to feel like you're not alone. And I think an ideal world would be where I find these people also journeying on the same path.
Maybe we had decided to savor the possibility of a discussion after two contributions. So maybe we can go straight to the second contribution, which is from Navtej Johar. As many of you know, that he's is one of the pioneers of contemporary dance in India, and we're really delighted to have him here contributing with a 20-minute input. Navtej is a Bharatnatyam and yoga practitioner, and what I find really personally very exciting about Navtej is that he sits in the middle of scholarship, choreography, and pedagogy. And in this contribution, he talks about his pedagogical approach, which is somatic in nature, and how that came about. And I think it kind of also speaks back to what Priyanka already has kind of opened up in her contribution, this conversation about ways in which Bharatnatyam gets taught. So I think we can go straight to Navtej and then open up. Shivaangee, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to remind everyone that after this, we'll have time also for everyone to kind of voice things that are happening for them. So stick around.
Yeah, so we're going to open up the chat box at some point. So it would be great for people who are here to write down their questions and type in their questions when the chat box opens. So keep sort of keeping your thoughts with you so you can put them down here. Thank you.
I actually, when I was growing up, I didn't even know that there was something. There was something called dance, or there was an option open to me, even remotely connected to dance. And so I began with theater, and I began with very political street theater. And this was like right after the emergency. So this is like 79, 80. And I worked for like 2-3 years, and I worked with Badal Sarkar too at that point. And he's the one who told me that you have a dancer's body. And that's what kind of started, made me start dreaming about being a dancer. And I started to kind of look around. And so when I came to Bharatnatyam at the age of 21, I went to Kalakshetra. I was like, I was completely seduced by it. I was seduced by everything that it stood for at that point in the early 1980s. And I was also seduced by Kalakshetra. It was so very beautiful. And I remained seduced, I would say, for a long time. Even though I had misgivings from the very beginning, I remained seduced, and I remained very, very faithful to it. And then along the way, because my other practice, my parallel practice was yoga, I continuously kind of felt a conflict between what yoga would give my body and what. And yoga gave me a homecoming right away, whereas dance would not, into my body. And I always kind of, wondered about that. Ki dono embodied practices hain, and why is one so accessible to the body and one is so forced upon the body? So that question kind of lingered in my mind for the longest time. And I did kind of, and then I began to feel dance. I began to feel the tedium of dance, the tedium of dance, or the restrictions of dance, and the restrictions of form, and the idea of correctness. And correctness meant at the level of form, at the level of the cultural identity of the form, and all those things. the idea of authenticity. And so I don't quite know as to when and where I got into the history of dance. Just kind of, and I must say that when I first kind of got into the history of dance and the idea that dance might have, it might not be as old and as pristine and as pure and as blemishless as it was proposed to me, I resisted it. I resisted it violently, like really, like it went against the grain of what I believed. But soon I began to reflect upon it, and when I began to study the history of dance, I took it with a pinch of salt. Um, I didn't kind of get into it immediately, but with a pinch of salt. And then many years, like I think it was in the 2000s almost, early 2000s, that I happened to read a book on the history of yoga. And it was a book by Mark Singleton about how yoga has been reconstructed over the last 100 years. And I just sat up. I actually sat up in bed and said, oh my God, this is too, I mean, this is, it was like a double whammy. So I couldn't ignore it anymore. I mean, now I was seeing a pattern. It wasn't just like a one-off thing. So I began to really see a pattern between how these two embodied practices had been kind of actually cleansed and refabricated and reconstructed, and a new moral code had been imposed upon it. So I think that's where my suspicion or my misgivings kind of were endorsed. And since then, my relationship with dance has been changing, and happily so. So like first, I was just kind of experimenting with the form, like anybody would experiment, as though it was all form. And then I began to kind of do these practices where I would want to kind of tune into the music and the ethos of the music that I liked so much, particularly the padam, and you all know about it, that my love for the padam. And the kind of imagination that the padam, or the idiosyncratic nature of the padams, especially the way they were sung earlier, kind of gave me a license to be idiosyncratic. And I really began to feel that the kind of body out of which such a song comes out, such an imagination comes out, cannot be a tamed body, cannot be a domesticated body. It has to be, there has to be something like unfettered about the body, out of which such imagination and such sounds or such music comes out. And I began to kind of create that space for myself from there on. I think it was really kind of, and I began to reimagine dance for myself as a very spacious space, not concerned with correctness of norm or form, but taking liberty, and playing with it. So I think that's where my relationship with dance changed, or began to change, and it's been changing since. When I began to kind of tune into the musicality of, say, the padam, for lack of a better word, I began to imagine a spaciousness, even a kind of a luxuriousness, and to me, it was a pondering space. It wasn't a space of knowing. It was a space of pondering. And and I realized that they had to be license and repose within that space. Repose was a very, very important. So there's no anxiety. And as I knew dance was totally anxiety ridden. There was the anxiety of form, the anxiety of correctness, the anxiety of the image. the anxiety of, upholding the image. And that image was not just of the dance, it was like upholding the image of India. This is what India is, and this is what Indian dance represents, and this is what it means, and this is what it symbolizes, and this is what the poetry means, and this is not a carnal, it's spiritual, all those things. So, and luckily, I knew that repose and that space firsthand through yoga. It was mine. Though I couldn't quite kind of coincide the two, because yoga was so easy. It was ease driven, not ease driven, but ease imbued. So how do I bring ease into my dance, or how do I allow my body? How do I allow my body ease? Was, I think, my main concern at that point. And so I think it was, even if I didn't realize it in the beginning or articulate it in the beginning to myself, there was a constant dialogue. There has been a constant dialogue between my yoga body and my dance body, my yoga experience and my dance experience. And I'm not saying the dance experience is not beautiful. The dance experience has been very, very beautiful. Like even the classical dance experience has been incredibly profound and beautiful. But there is a sense of upholding, as though it's a responsibility, it's as though it's a dharma, it's an obligation rather. And I didn't want to dance out of obligation. I mean, I have no obligation as such. I mean, there is something, the experience of beauty is not an obligation. It's an appetite. And it's a human appetite. It's a shared appetite. It satisfies me as much as it may satisfy you. So I think for a few years, so to speak, and this has been a like prolonged few years, I kind of stepped back from dance. I took a kind of a pause. I put dance on pause. I mean, I never was kind of driven to dance. I wasn't one of those ambitious dancers who had to go on stage and perform. So I took a kind of a long hiatus where I kind of just kind of stayed with my body. I would go to my studio, do my yoga practice, began with a movement practice, but within you see, what happens is that to me, this space out of which this music arises, so to speak, is an ambience. There's an ambience. And I mean, first of all, I have to move and imagine to create that ambience. That is the first step. And then to stay with that ambience and live in that ambience and move out of that ambience and sustain that ambience and have that ambience shade every articulation that you make. And because that ambience is of repose, every articulation is uneager, unanxious. There's a casualness to it. There's an ease to it. So it is not there's no purpose as such. And yet it is deeply purposeful when it comes down to the satisfaction quotient, so to speak. So, so I don't quite know how somatics happened upon me. I really, truly don't know. Except that I bought time. I allowed myself time. And by just allowing myself time, things began to kind of happen. And of course, it started because I started to honor the prompts of the body, so to speak. I mean, I realized that the body is never, ever quiet. It's always murmuring. And these murmurs, if you begin to listen to them, can be quite compelling. So I began to kind of really detect those murmurs in the body and move upon them. And once you begin to move upon them, they have a laid out network. You know, there's a whole trajectory out there. It's not a random thing. There's a whole like electrical circuit out there. And I guess that's where my somatic practice began. And there was another thing that always kind of, from the very beginning, I had this question that how do you teach Abhinaya? Abhinaya is a very, very important part of Bharatnatyam, and I love Abhinaya. But I could never figure out that how do you teach Abhinaya? How do you Abhinaya is not, imitation is not Abhinaya. I have to allow myself to go somewhere in order to kind of emerge in Abhinaya. So, so I was completely unconvinced at all the models I had seen of teaching Abhinaya, good, bad, indifferent. Basically, there can be just the teacher can give me a blueprint about, what to follow. But to inhabit Abhinaya it falls upon me, and now I say it now I know it very clearly that more than of course, there is a vocabulary and there are gestures and there are all these things. But more than that, it requires a license. Because Abhinaya is not foreign to the body. All of us do Abhinaya. Like I keep saying that if we have caught ourselves talking to ourselves, we know Abhinaya. We do Abhinaya. Because it's like, it's a conversation we are having in our heads and it is articulated upon our bodies reflexively. But I don't allow myself, like, normatively, we don't allow ourselves, we don't give ourselves that license to divulge or make public that very, very private moment of having a conversation with ourselves, or having a conversation with a not even an imagined other, with an evoked other, with a conjured other, a conjured other who has a power. It is not that we have just imagined it and then started to give it. The other emerges before the conversation starts. That's when my articulation begins. So this license is something that I have to give myself. And I also realized that the pedagogy that is popular today does not give that license. In fact, it equips you with all the vocabulary, all the methods, but it evokes that license because it doesn't allow, because it cannot afford to give you freedom because it's a national project. It has to first of all, fulfill the obligation of the national project. That means I can't have license. I have a brief. And this is to debrief yourself. And debriefing is something, I think, studying the history first, going into the history of dance first, and then going into the philosophy of aesthetics and poetics and yoga and even spirituality and all those things, gave me that license, because once I began to really understand that the received truths that have come to me through the pedagogy of dance are not sound. And the history of dance is not seamless. The history of dance, once I began to realize that this was a heavily manipulated history, and it has been manipulated not only, through the last, through our national history, so to speak, it has been, the philosophy has been tampered with, so to speak, for centuries. So once I realized that this tampering, what are received truths are tampered, then those received truths lost their weightage, so to speak. And the more those received truths kind of became unsound or fabricated, the more license I received. Because I realized, this is all made up. These are constructs. And these are not only constructs, these are constructs with heavy agendas behind them, and very mean agendas, some of them, and very self-serving agendas, many of them, and very defensive agendas. The national project, it's a very defensive image that we put across as a, this is Bharatnatyam. It's not immoral, it's moral. Don't mistake us. So these are like, we are on the back foot, so to speak. So, I believe that inquiry is, like, if I have to tell people today, I think inquiry is the first thing to gain license. And to me, there's no poetry without license. There's no beauty without license. There's no space without license. I mean, I make these, and then it's like making constructs, making very, very complicated constructs with the underlying conviction that I'm making them to erase them. So that's the excitement, that I make something up, I clutter something up, I clutter up the space, and then with one stroke, the whole thing, like a house of cards, falls down, and wow, there's emptiness again. And it's such a relief. It's such a, when the aha moment happens, that, oh, how nice, this breathing space again. Because so it's like really creating space and gaining breathing space is what my practice is about. And I also realized one thing, that this repose I was talking about, that I call it, I mean, yoga calls it sukh. Sukh is a very important, according to me, an integral component of yoga. And sukh is this spaciousness. So sukh is, first of all, a prerequisite of coming into the body. And then I'm also convinced that there is no rasa without sukh. Rasa comes out of a place of repose. Rasa doesn't come out of a place of clutter or anxiety. Rasa is when that house of cards falls, that's when rasa happens. It's not the building of the house of cards, so to speak. That is the anticipation and the excitement and the engagement. But so and that house of cards crumbles only because I have built it with the intention of erasing it. I have not built it with the intention of projecting. And that's what I think, that's the biggest problem today, that we are dancing to project.
Do you think this is a good moment to open the chat box for questions, as Shivaangee and I perhaps have a few thoughts to share with each other from these two contributions? Perhaps people can already start populating the chat box.
The thing with the chat is that it's still, I can't change the settings midway through the conversation, so it will still come through to me and I will pass it to you, I think. Is that all right?
Yeah.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
You need to trust me there. I'll just write to everyone.
Maybe Mandeep, you can start us off with some of the questions or conundrums that are coming up.
I have actually a kind of two oppositional forces that came about for me in these two contributions, and I thought that actually these oppositional forces, in a way, could also become a kind of spectrum on which to position one's pedagogy. And this really is a spectrum that lies between repose, rest, and rigor at the other end. And there is something about both of these things being present in the space, and the way they kind of negotiate with each other. And Priyanka kind of sets that up in her contribution. But for me, I think what Navtej proposes is what's most exciting about his proposition is, how does one take away anxiety from the practice of dance, and the anxiety of putting up a kind of projection. And so what is really has stayed with me is, how does one set up a pedagogical space that makes freedom or license available at all times? And that's something that jumps out at me from these two contributions, and I'm quite sort of excited to take this further. But Shivaangee, if you have any other thoughts, or Henny, if you have any thoughts, please jump in.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, I think thanks for naming those. I think I'm also going to add to that, like this idea of I think correctness. What does correctness offer us? I think Navtej used this beautiful phrase, the tedium of correctness. And I think correctness is something that maybe dances across the spectrum of, have a relationship with. So I think it'll be interesting to go into that. And also just, I think this might be an opportunity to bring in now they're sort of doing an interview, I think, and having their own discourse, but the London Adabu session upstairs, part of the reason that they're here actually for the event and part of this space is because one of the things we were interested in earlier on, Mandeep, was what does ritual offer us? What does the ritual of repetition offer us? And Adabu practice is something that is repetitive, and it is ritualistic in the sense that you go through the motions again and again and again. And it's also kind of codified like rituals are, in even the ritual itself of, which Adabus you start with, how you traverse through them, the up to second speed, up to third speed, back down to second speed, back down to first speed, take a break, and then next, like there's so many codifications in the kind of training and practice. And how does that intersect with our discussion on pedagogy? And I like the way Priyanka also sort of started talking about what she's let go of and what she's kept, and this experience of letting things go, how easily some things fall away and how some things don't fall away so easily, and they kind of stick to you. I think that's where I'm at with my response. Henny also.
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably going to be saying the same thing, but maybe slightly different words. But so this relationship between training and, you just mentioned training and practice, and I think that's quite key here. But this thing of training for something in order to let it go feels so relevant in this conversation, in both of their conversations in a way, where in order to find some freedom, or is it necessary in order to find some kind of freedom or release of something to have that precision training? And some of my questions are around, you talked about, Navtej talked about the tedium of correctness that you then mentioned. And I wondered if there's something else that isn't just about correctness, but something about the word precision being in there. And I think Priyanka talked about neatness. I really enjoyed that word. But I relate that to sort of precision. And I also remember you speaking, Shivaangee, about doing Adabu practice and kind of loving that about it, the fact that it's this and not that, when something, and is that different to sort of correctness for someone else, like achieving some perfection that's outside of yourself or some ideal form, but actually the pleasure of precision in being able to go, I'm doing this and not that. And that training offers that to us somehow, like you can't, without having some sort of form in the body, you can't get that kind of, it's this and not that. I wonder, I mean, maybe you can, I don't know. I've come from sort of a classical training that then has completely sort of let go of it. And, I wouldn't say what I do is formless at all, but I tend to want to play around with different forms. But I think something in what both of they were saying was really touching that for me. And then I really remembered that Shivaangee had also spoken earlier on about commitment, and that also being this sort of quite pleasurable place, whilst it has this double edge of the pressure and the enforcement. Where is it? Where can you own it, and where is it something that's sort of put on from outside of you? Yeah,
and I feel like for me, you've kind of hit the nail on the head when you talk about like, who is it for? What is it for? And I think the idea of service is like often a kind of like a filter. I feel it's a really apt way to figure out like what's happening with your labor in any moment is who is that in service to, and I think there are ways maybe of laboring to be in service of yourself, or at least in service of what you want to be in service of. And I think pedagogically, what tends to happen instead is that you are laboring in service of the form which sits on a pedestal, which you must not disrespect, and which you have a responsibility to promote and a responsibility to protect, and the kind of like channeling of your labor kind of goes towards this higher other. And I think that's where, like, for me, it becomes like problematic quite quickly. And I think, oh, I was going to say something. Mandeep, you said something earlier about, nope, I can't remember. I'm just going to leave it there. Yeah.
The other thought that I had.
Sorry.
Oh yeah. Okay, go.
It's about ease. When you're talking about how do we find ease in the kind of discomfort of training our bodies in this way? And I think for me, ease is really directly linked also to service. And yes, any.
Just to say, there's now 2 questions in the chat. Do you want to jump in, Mandeep, or should we go to the questions in the chat?
No, I just wanted to add one thing because I think it feels a bit urgent to me around this question of repetition. And I think we've had this conversation before also, that for me, the repetition itself becomes a kind of way to consolidate a certain kind of history. And I think when Navtej says that many years later, perhaps even a decade later, when he encountered the history of dance, everything changed for him in the way that he had to get away from dance for a few years. And I think for me also, sort of coming into dance history took a long time because it doesn't get dished out with the form, unfortunately. And that's exactly what should happen, so that you're transparently consenting to repeat a set of movements that have been brutalized, coming from a brutalization of communities, of histories, of rewriting of histories. And I find that repetition without that consciousness of what is it that you're repeating? What kind of projection are you setting up? What kind of larger co-option are you part of? I find that that repetition is actually central to the problematics of these forms. And I just I find that Navtej's proposition of taking a pause is a delicious one, because actually what that makes you do is to engage with what is it that you're actually doing, because otherwise you could be doing it for years and then you realize that you've been in a kind of national cultural nationalism project and you just didn't know it. And yeah, just wanted to put that there because I think it's kind of important for me.
Thank you. Okay, so we have some lovely things in the chat. So I might just say a few of them, and then because some of them feel quite interrelated, some of them actually feel a bit like covering a little bit what you've just been talking about, Mandeep. So from Susan Sentler, we have, does it always need or have to be in relation to? So thinking of pedagogy there, does it need to be in relation to 3 question marks? And then she's also talking about rigor in the rest, in the pause. So it's more of a comment there. And then there's a question that I think you sort of touched on, Mandeep, from Sanjeevini Dutta, responding to your remark that you needed to find some Indianness when you were studying at Laban. And in the context of watching well-known Indian contemporary dance company and feeling that there's no history on their bodies. So something about the history in the body, and another question that relates to that. Do you think of the body as an archive? And this is from Rakesh Mohindra, who says, amazing so far, in the sense of producing or representing a certain image. How does the presence or not of an audience change the performance? That's a slightly different question, but this notion of, do you think of the body as an archive? And I've written archive down about 3 times in my notes. So yeah, the archive of the body in relation to historical archival forms that are passed through to us feel like it's hugely relevant in this conversation, where the body archive meets a sort of presented to us historical archive. Do you want me to repeat any of those questions?
Do you think you could put them in a chat box to us, Henny, so you can just see them written down?
To everyone, actually, you can just put them.
I can put them to everyone. Sorry,
Yeah,
I will pass them through. That's what I need to do. I forgot. So this is what this one is. Okay, there. That's from. Everyone. Okay, there we go. This is from Rakesh.
Yeah, I can just actually start with that comment by Sanjeevani. That's exactly how I felt when I was at Laban. That my own body had become a body that had no history at all. And yet years later, after having trained a little bit in Bharatnatyam, I realized that the history that had come onto my body was a history that I didn't quite know what I was taking on when I learned it on the job like that, in sort of in a playful environment without actually getting any kind of historical context of that practice. And I only kind of discovered it along the way. So yeah, I feel like there's a contradiction there. Not having a history to me was it seemed problematic, but then to have a history on the body that has not been wasn't transparent to me became equally problematic. So yeah, I'm not quite sure whether it's resolved for me to not have access to form is possibly not where I would be heading. There is, I find that there is something specific I can draw from Indian cultural resources, and yet I find that I want to be able to make choices about what I'm taking on, and how am I transforming or embodying that information, so that it doesn't get given to me in a kind of lineage of ossification, that you can't touch it, you can't change it, but that I take it on knowing that I'm continuing a kind of conversation. I'm continuing a dialogue, and if one was to really look at dance as dialogue, then how would it change? How would one's training change? How would one also begin to embody it differently?
Having a moment of rigorous rest.
There's another comment from Susan.
Yeah, I find actually this is key for me, actually, that there's something about rituals that's compelling. It gives you it gives you a grid to place your body upon. It gives you a practice. It gives you a kind of framework for repetition. Rituals also keep ideas alive, belief systems alive, because belief systems don't remain alive if they don't have rituals attached to them. So the question is, how do we make up our rituals on the basis of our beliefs? What beliefs do we want to perform? What histories would we want to perform? Is it possible for us to set up our own rituals? And can rituals, like what Susan is proposing, can they be in a constant state of flux, that you don't really allow them to settle for too long, or not at all? And yet they give you some kind of framework to place yourself in. But yeah, I'm also beginning to ramble, Susan, so I'll stop there.
I think in everything that we're all saying, in my head at least, I keep circling back to this idea of autonomy and how autonomy feels like the key to unlocking some of these like speculations. Like, for example, in what you just said, Mandeep, about sort of rituals, allowing rituals to be like fluid and changing over time. I feel like the unfixedness that we're desiring maybe comes from a receptivity, sensitivity to individual autonomy, and rituals that have that receptivity embedded in that framework to individuals' autonomy, a bit like Priyanka was talking about her person-centered approach to pedagogy, of each person as they come into the studio brings a different set of baggage, a different curiosity, a different mood, a different intention, and how for her that, you know, Bharatnatyam changes for each person, and for each of her students it's a different thing. I wonder whether, yeah, Mandeep, in response, like maybe it's about embedding that sensitivity to individual autonomy inside a ritual. And I also, yeah. And I'm thinking as I say that, like, what is it about our rituals, for example, of the Adabi practice or of just training in dance, that where does that like individual autonomy like become disconnected from what we do? And for me, like, I'm thinking aloud, I don't know, but I feel like it comes from privileging the visual over the somatic, privileging the sense of like what it's meant to look like when you dance and what people are meant to be seeing, the geometry you're meant to be seeing rather than the geometry you're meant to be feeling, and how you're appearing as an indication of what's going on for you rather than how you're feeling as an indication of what's going on for you, and how you're appearing to be an indication of how well you're doing the ritual rather than how you're feeling to be an indication of how you're doing the ritual. And I don't know, maybe I'm drawing a false binary here, but there's something about like privileging like what we look like and what the form looks like, that I think the disconnect begins with individual autonomy and a sense of fluidity. And that in my head is also traces back to, I'm thinking like, where is that obsession with the visual come from? And as far as I understand at this point, I feel like it comes from the reconstruction of dance to look a certain way, to fulfill a certain agenda. And when something needs to be a symbolic representation, then that symbolic representation needs to be precise, like visually, it needs to be specific. And I wonder whether that's the break where it stopped being about individual practitioners' experiences and started being about a symbol that needs to be visually coherent.
Mm-hmm. And upheld, so that it can be precise, so that it can be repeated. It can be precise so that it can remain unchanging. Yeah, so this precision / rigor / thing kind, these words then begin to hold something in place.
Yeah, and as I'm also thinking like, okay, but when I practice, like I'm like, have I experienced that possibility of like being technically rigorous via just my like sense of what I'm doing, and that also feels like a bit impossible, because I don't know whether it feels impossible or just like, you know, when I hold my arm up, like, yes, I have a sense of like what feels like I'm engaging the right things and what feels like this is how it's meant to be, but sometimes that doesn't translate. Like I always get told by everyone that my palm is too out, this is too facing up, it just needs to be a little bit further down. And I'm like, yeah, okay, so you're saying it's about my rotation and that my rotation needs to change a little bit, but in my body I feel like that is perfect. So then
I have a question that's just sort of coming up for me, because it's not a word that I don't think anyone's used it particularly, but I was thinking of the term discipline and like having a, like the forms we work with are sort of disciplines, or we might call this one discipline as opposed to another discipline. And I'm just really curious about that word and whether it's something that how you feel about it. Like, is it something that you go, ugh? Because it's like, we are disciplined, we become disciplined, like states, like oppressive powers discipline us, or when we're bad, we discipline ourselves, that's all we are. And yet there's something sort of crucial. I mean, I'm relating to it particularly about like, if I don't have some sort of discipline, like a framework to work within, I'm really sort of all over the place. I can't get up in the morning. I mean, that's related to life on some level, but it relates to these practices, you know, like a dance form having a really, you know, it can have a strict discipline, but any discipline implies some strictness to some degree, doesn't it? I don't know, the word seems to imply it. Anyway, I wonder.
I think for me, the word discipline becomes problematic when it is being proposed to a larger number of people as something that everyone must perform as a discipline. But I think when I'm wondering whether something changes if you think about setting up a discipline for yourself, setting up a kind of practice, a ritual, a discipline, whatever you want to call it. And like what Navtej says, that you build it with the knowledge that you will break it, that it doesn't stay, it doesn't get, you know, it's not something that gets, like Priyanka says, it doesn't get passed on. It's not, you don't build it to pass it on. You build it to experience something, knowing that it is to be given up and razed to the ground. And I'm wondering whether that then changes the way we engage with the question of discipline.
Mandeep, sorry, can you say that last thing again? I got distracted. The last question you posed about discipline.
No, I'm wondering whether our relationship with the word discipline changes when it is really seen as something that you voluntarily set up for yourself, knowing, like Navtej proposes, that it's going to be brought down, that it is not going to stay and it's going to come down like a house of cards.
I mean, it feels like that's something to sort of propose for all sorts of frameworks, really. Like a framework is just there as it's a scaffold that comes down when you don't need it anymore, or when you want to change its shape. Yeah.
I feel like the sense of like orbiting is like creates ease for me in this idea of discipline and ritual. When I think of discipline, ritual, repetition as linear, it feels more oppressive than when I think of it as orbital and circular. So circular, but maybe also like going that way a bit and then like going up there and then going, like in the sense that like there can be points at which the quality of that completely changes, but it's okay. It's like not anxiety inducing, because you will return back to a place where that feels easy again, or that feels like you want to do it again. And I feel like, yeah, there's something to do with ease and something to do with it accepting like the natural evolution, not evolution, but the natural like changing, the natural change that happens over time with anything. So like if you set up a discipline for yourself, as you're suggesting, Mandeep, like what if that was only for some time, and then maybe for not some other time, and then maybe again for some time, and then maybe not for some other time, and you just see how it goes.
Shall I respond to Kanika's question?
Yeah.
So I think after being back here since 2008, I think for me, especially after inhabited geometry, I had deliberately put this question of Indianness aside for myself, because I think this to entertain questions of whether my work is Indian, not Indian, is something that I wanted to put aside because it wasn't of concern to me. For me, what was important was that I lived in India. I had the experience of living in India and working with bodies that were in India, looking at political and social forces in India, then the work can't not be Indian. I think for me, I sort of assumed it and put it aside because it felt like not a very useful conversation for me to be engaging with, except when the work gets invited outside of India. And I have found myself repeatedly being the work being framed within festivals of India, or where the framing is always Indian, and then you sort of think that actually, yeah, okay, fine, you're suddenly Indian again because you're stepping outside of your country, and then you realize that you're part of a sort of a mixed bag of things from India, and you become a kind of a little what's it called, an exhibition of India. And then you kind of think, okay, am I okay with that? Am I okay with that framing? And then there have been times where I was just like, okay, I really don't want, I think I would really like the work to be programmed because it is work that is interesting for you, and not because it is Indian work that you'd like to put out for your audiences. And then I realized that I fell from the Indian what do you call it, bag straight into the queer bag, and I found myself being programmed as what was that one kind of articulation? It was queers in exile. And I remember thinking, actually, I'm not in exile. So, so I found myself sort of going from the fire into the from the pot into, from the frying pan into the fire. So yeah, I don't think for me, it's not necessary in finding a valid Indian identity, but I find myself having to engage with those questions repeatedly because of the kinds of ways in which my work gets programmed outside of India.
Quite a big question from Parvati. Yeah. Mandeep, feel free to go first if you have something that you're already thinking.
Yeah, and I think for me it's an important question because I've spent the last sort of 15 years really trying to work sort of not from one particular set of community, but from by trying to place myself within a kind of larger community of practitioners. I think with Gati Dance Forum's work from 2005 onwards, the one thing that was important to some of us who started working at Gati about 15-20 years ago was this was the question that you couldn't really be an artist in India, only an artist, that because there aren't any support structures and any ready-made spaces for people to come together, that one had to somehow be an ecology builder alongside being an artist. And I think that very early on, for many of us, it became very important to be around each other. And that sort of quickly spread to several sort of nodal points across the country. So Gati had sort of these several artist-run organizations across the country that began to sort of speak to each other, begin to receive each other's work, to present each other's work, and all of that became really important. And for me now, I function out of Khuli Khirki, which is a space in New Delhi that about 40 of us co-rent. And for us, it became a kind of, in the middle of the pandemic, it became quite important to know that others were around in the city. We were about to lose this space that used to function as Gati Dance Forum. And to hold on to that space, we realized that we couldn't do it as individuals. We couldn't do it as an organization anymore, because it was hard to sustain an organization in this given sort of political, economic environment. So we came together, and it's a kind of growing community. We're about 40 of us now, who on a sliding scale contribute different amounts of rent, sometimes none. If you can't afford it, you know, paying rent is not the way to become part of this community. But just to know that there are other people and that they can come into the studio and be part of your rehearsal process has been central to my kind of imagination of making work in dancing. Yeah, so I couldn't imagine my work without a sense of a larger community. I don't think I could make it in isolation. That's possibly why I've never even attempted a solo, because I know that I really want to. For me, dance is it's a relational act, and yeah, I kind of really savor that for myself.
I'm still trying to figure out what Bharati means with her question, but I'm going to speak to what I understand in it, which is, yeah, this idea of like not having to go through isolation when you're going through a transition in your practice. And I feel like also this idea kind of like of apology and shame when you leave practice and leave practicing. For me is like linked to the specificity of how we even frame or consider practice in Indian classical dance. And I've definitely like struggled with periods of leaving it or turning away from it because it feels like a nothingness, or like, yeah, it feels like a nothingness if I'm not engaging with it in the specific way that it's been taught, or like the specific way that it is practiced. And I feel like I want to advocate for the kind of borders of, or the definition of our Indian classical dance practices to be much broader, the borders to be much like wider and bigger, so that they can encompass, you know, encompass doing in a very different way, encompass doing in terms of speculating, doing in terms of writing, doing in terms of speaking, doing in terms of just like processing, or doing in terms of like other disciplines, you know, like whatever, filmmaking, drawing, like reading, watching. So I guess that's one thing that feels important for me, to find ease in periods of trauma, rest, shame, etc., is to also try and like widen the definition of what Indian classical dance practice is, so that it doesn't feel like you're like giving it up or like exiting it. How can you still be participating in it when you're absent, or how can it be participating in you when it's absent? But I think I definitely echo like Mandeep's sentiment that like patient community is like the crux of continuing with something, I feel like, for me as well. And I mentioned earlier in my little spiel in the beginning, but Rerooted Dance Collective, which Bharati is part of, like that was a space for us to come together regularly, regardless of whether we wanted to dance or not, or where we were in our orbits with it. Yeah, I hope that speaks to Bharati's question. Yeah. Mandeep, how do you feel about going on to Sandra's contribution, or do you think there's a little bit more to unpick in our discussion here?
I think we could go on and then continue to unpick towards the end. So there's more time towards the end to continue discussion. And then we've got also these contributions to spark off new dimensions to this dialogue.
Cool. So as Henny's pulling up Sandra's video, again, Sandra does her own self-introduction, so I don't really need to say anything, just that I'm really, really pleased to be able to connect with her in this way. And yeah, I'm just gonna let her speak and do it better.
I'm the fairest woman of this village. I'm fair and fair. I'm well decorated with flowers and sandal, making me fairer. I'm in love with the Dark Lord, the administrator, the most attractive man of the village. He's black.
Hi, my name is Sandra Chatterjee, and I would like to start by thanking Shivaangee and Mandeep to invite me to be part of this conversation. Let me take a few moments to introduce myself. I am a choreographer, dancer, and scholar of dance and culture and performance studies. I've been sort of pursuing dance and scholarship in parallel for a couple of decades now. I'm based currently primarily in Germany, but I divide my time between Germany, India, and Austria. So my practice sort of spans different geographic and cultural contexts, and I also lived in the US for quite a while, so that context also plays a role to some extent. Initially, I'm trained in Kuchipudi and also Bharatnatyam. Specifically during college, I also did some training in ballet, in modern and postmodern dance forms, later in contemporary dance, contemporary European dance in specific. And I've had the opportunity to study Odissi relatively late in my life as a dancer, but I've always loved the form, so I'm very grateful for that. And another forms that have had a great impact on me have been Polynesian dance forms, which I studied and danced specifically again during my time in college, which was at the University of Hawaii in Honolulu. And I really, really love different Latin American dance forms, which I practice relatively regularly, but they don't necessarily make it directly. I don't make it onto stage with them directly, but they really emphasize or influence how I move and how I think about dance and moving as a more social encounter, a physical encounter. So I'm already getting a little bit into some of the initial questions that Shivaangee raised in our sort of pre-talk to this video. And this concerns kind of my practice of Indian dance and the structures it interacts with. My impulse to start creating contemporary choreography has been a source of, or the impulse was really a feeling of discomfort. And a discomfort not necessarily with the classical forms as such that I'm practicing, but specifically in Europe and in the US with the way they've been received. And that reception, which I encountered since my teens, has been one of a kind of exotification, which of course is linked to a racist matrix of viewing. And an exotifying gaze, a kind of sense of objectification, a sense of not necessarily being witnessed or received as a person dancing who has her own standpoint, her own interpretations, her own negotiations with the form, which of course reflect themselves in the performance, in the here and now, but to be received as a kind of representation, and a representation specifically of more of a fantasy of India or of ancient India, of a temple dancer. So, and the initial impulse that I think in some way, shape, or form still follows me has been with breaking that gaze. And I think that gaze is very specific in quote unquote the West, but it's also kind of inherited. I started with this kind of maybe narrow focus on my own, how I felt as a dancer on stage and how I felt vis-a-vis that gaze of the audience, and confronting that, and initially trying to confront that sort of quote-unquote fourth wall, but more than the fourth wall, the distance and the anonymity of the audience. Trying to confront that with playing with the form. But I'm also have always been really driven by trying to find a connection between larger social-political contexts and dance. So an effort to try to not stay with a self-reflecting and only stay with deconstructing a form and deconstructing the space in which the form is presented, but really use my training as a dancer, which has given me a certain skill of communication through the body and through dance, to talk about or to transport or to communicate about larger issues concerning privilege, racism, classism, casteism, and that making that connection or finding a way to have I don't really want to say to have the dance I do speak to that, but to learn how to use my trained dancing body as a medium to raise specific issues and to bring them into the room, and try to initiate a kind of engagement with the audience or dialogue with the audience through what I can present through my dancing body or with my dancing body, or increasingly with the help yes, stage design, but more in an installation way, and really invite the audience to discover, to engage with, to read, to write. I love asking the audience also questions, not necessarily during the performance and on stage as a speaker on stage, but throughout the room. I love to create spaces, I love to create rooms, which the audience can enter even pre-performance or stay in post-performance, and where there are things to sort of read and discover and respond to. So I'm early on my contemporary practice, or my dance practice, started very early in life, in my teens, and so at that time, I think the way I still grapple with the same questions, but the range has really expanded, not just in how I grapple with it, but also what I grapple with. I got increasingly, obviously, kind of grounded in cultural, political discourses of addressing, critiquing, resisting. Though for me, somehow dialogue has always remained a central trope. I'm very, very interested in finding ways to talk about difficult topics of discrimination, difficult topics of racism, classism, to also obviously engage, to confront my own privileges as a dancer, because I do think that, particularly in my context, how I dance or where I dance, where I learned to dance, it's a tremendously privileged context. To have the chance to learn classical Indian dance in the first place is a huge privilege. It's very expensive. It takes a lot of space. It takes a lot of resources. It takes a lot of money. It takes a lot of time. Time is a very, very, very important aspect of privilege that I think we underestimate, or we like to forget about. Like having the time to train, to practice, is a huge privilege in our context. Growing up in Germany, in the US, living in the US, so confronting my own privileges, but also the audience that comes, and the audience that comes into the theater, trying to also ask them to investigate or question their own privileges or their own positionality. I continue to try to see how this form of contemporary dance can reach beyond the theater and beyond the privileged audience, which I feel like is more, I'm personally better able to do that through sort of practice, through teaching, through workshops, through inviting people who love to dance to come and dance. But not so much with the contemporary kind of, maybe a little bit more, yeah, to the specific work that brings in a specific audience. So that is a continuing struggle on how to break that. However, I'm also really interested in kind of infiltrating the sort of spaces, the stages. Specifically, right now I'm working mostly in Germany with this work on smell, with things that you don't usually find in those contemporary dance theaters. For example, contemporary dance, which is based on non-Western dance forms like classical Indian dance. I work a lot with a dancer, Dudu Silvoigt, who is trained in contemporary African dance, for example. But also to bring in other senses. I've always been interested in my confrontation of the gaze with the question of sensuality and how you can be sensual without being objectified or sexualized. And so the step to really opening up the senses and opening up beyond the visual and trying to engage beyond the visual is actually a small step. And I didn't choose smells as a kind of like tool. It was more of an impulse. I love smells, but I'm also really reacting to them. I get really allergic to them. And I started researching them with a team of different people like that, like back in 2019. And so there's two aspects. One of them is engaging with smells and engaging with instances. I often came up with this came across this saying to listen to a smell. And so I was really struck by this, and I thought that if you can listen to a smell, then you can probably also dance to a smell. So with a team of dancers trained in contemporary African dance like Dudu, and then hip hop and ballet and contemporary dance like Zizat Sagisi, or contemporary dance like Jaskaran Singh Anand, I've been really experimenting with trying to find out a way to move, to listen to a smell and move to it. But I found also that just to show that on stage doesn't make, even though it gives us really interesting insights in how smells behave more than anything, because the movement gives them a spatial dimension, which goes beyond the smelling, and you can, after a while and after really engaging and learning how to work with it and learning how to perceive it, you can see how different smells transform into different movements, and they can bring different movement languages together in a space and hold them together kind of invisibly by being in response to the same smell. But it's not something that's very obvious to the audience. So I started to include like little warm-ups or workshops, asking the audience themselves to really try to find a movement to a smell, to really try to enter that process, and then to be able to receive movement on a different level. So the smells were kind of a way of opening up or catalyzing different dimensions of racialization, different dimensions of classism, different dimensions of casteism, which kind of go beyond, say, the visual or and we go beyond the ways in which we talk about these divisions or divisive forces generally. But they are also a great way to enter into conversation with an audience, because it seems that everybody has something to say about smells, be it because smell is so personal, but smell is also really tied to your own memories. Smell is very visceral. Audiences have a reaction to smell. They have a feeling about smelling something as moment they are smell agents in space. And audience also has something to say about smell. And so to make that connection, or to start a conversation, and to try to figure out to use a kind of physical engagement with smell, but then also connect it to the larger issues we're talking about, is an ongoing effort. But bringing in something like smell, both in an artistic way, in a way to generate movement, and in a way to talk about a political issue or a social political issue, social political divisions, has been a productive journey so far, though there's a lot to remain discovered. Specifically, also to try, like I said, to open up a kind of work like this, or to open up my work in general beyond the kind of very elite and privileged space of the theater. And the theater audience is definitely a challenge which I would like to continue working on.
We can smoothly move on to our last contribution by Avni Sethi, who has a really interesting practice of having conceptualized a museum called the Conflictorium in Ahmedabad, and also having a dance practice. And I think she talks about the ways in which these two practices speak to each other. And yeah, we can go straight into
I've spent the last 10 years working on a museum called the Conflictorium, and the Conflictorium is in a sense a attempt to rethink the museum as a nomenclature at all. And some of the principles that I feel like were deployed in the last 10 years of how museums can be alive, open, political, breathing spaces were directly transported from my dance experience. It meant that what and how we were designing spaces or curating work was always about thinking through what is a visitor going to breathe, which breath is the visitor going to breathe. And very often in thinking about, okay, so they go through experience number 1, 2, and 3, and then they come and breathe out in experience number 4. I think that imagining that a person who enters and experiences a museum is not only a mind, is not only a cognitive being, but is a full body. And that as a museum, you actually influence and impact a full body. And therefore, sometimes you use text and image, but sometimes you use sound and movement to mark this body within space. And I think that understanding of what visitors or audiences should experience or could experience potentially, or what we may want to offer as an experience, comes from having understood a dancing body and nowhere else. So for example, if I have to speak about one specific piece, which is a sound installation at the Conflictorium, which is also in a sense an introductory piece within the larger museum when you enter the space, is called In This House and That World, where there's dressing table. The history of this building where the museum is located was that it was owned by a 92-year-old Parsi woman who was a hairdresser. And in a sense, that installation acknowledges her presence and her life's politics as a single child-free person. But what the installation actually does is to guide you to look at your own body and to locate yourself in this neighborhood, in this building, and actually respond by subtracting something from your own body, your hair. You cut the hair and you leave it behind, which then becomes a part of the permanent archive of this museum as you entered. That whole telling actually in my mind was a performance piece where I was not present, maybe my body was not present, but my voice was present, taking someone through 8 minutes of multiple kinds of expressions and ultimately leading to them moving in particular kind of ways. So I feel like the museum practice has always been informed by my performance mind and my performance body. And as far as then my performance work is concerned, I think often I have used the need to respond to physical space or to respond to political time. So on an axis of time and space, I think when is it that I have felt the motivation that now my body can move? It's not out of habit that my body must move. It's not a habituated dancer's body, but it is a body that feels like it's been pushed enough that no longer can I use the medium of image text anymore, and that the only thing that's possible to respond with is a moving body. And so I find it really difficult, to respond to a question saying, are you making work in this moment? I feel like I can't be ever making work as a continual process, but it really occurs when there is no other way to do it. Maybe for an example, maybe we can think of जब प्यार किया तो डरना क्या, as an example of precisely this, it's not like I was thinking about this work for long or anything. There was a time in 2017 when in the city of Ahmedabad, there were graffitis that came up across the city, like carpet bombed the city, that said, Hindu daughters should be careful of love jihad, or beware of love jihad. And it's so uncomfortable, no? Because your body inhabits that city. I used to pass by those streets every single day, from home to work, and that is really talking to me. I am that person they are talking to, that Hindu daughter who's falling in love with Muslim men. So it's really directed at me personally. And it was a visceral response. It was, yes, of course, that my body is trained in a certain grammar and therefore it responds within that grammar. But it was visceral to say that now this dancing body must be placed to make something that's seemingly so background, because our politics, they're so present in our time, but they're always pushed to seem like they are in the background. And I felt like when dancing bodies are placed in spaces, they have the ability to move something from the background to the foreground, if they wish to do so. And I felt like that was really a moment when, while a body, like a dancer is in a full attire, is in public space, you can't ignore it. But while you can't ignore it, you can suddenly make something else visible that was invisible for so long, and make the dancing body actually invisible by, invert and subvert that whole relationship. I think that's interesting to me in this kind of play between dance as a visibilizing force, but visibilizing what? This particular body or something else. So I was trained in Kathak. I started training when I was 7 years old, and I had many teachers across the city of Ahmedabad. And I think I had many teachers because I was restless and I couldn't just get the answers that I was looking at, even starting age 12, 14, 16, 18, 23, so on and so forth. And what I couldn't get answers to was why am I doing what I'm doing, and why must I do it like this? And we might have, as a practitioner now, I might be able to look back and say, hey, repetition has value, discipline has value, and these are values that dance training forwards, or the pedagogic space forwards as really like virtues. But when they come to me with a certain kind of sacredness, they came to me, I received them as sacred. I think I couldn't understand that. But yet you continue, because there's something that's deeply fulfilling in doing that. And so I continued doing it until this choice. And because in India, two forms, at least in the way I received my training, it felt like there were two forms of dance that were really pitted against each other. There was Kathak, and then there was Bharatnatyam. Bharatnatyam was the good person's dance form, where it was adopted, or rather co-opted, into the larger nation building project, and it was a good symbol of good patriotic values. And then there was Kathak, which was that was influenced by the Mughal, and that its only purpose and scope was the entertainment of the Mughals, and therefore its aesthetic, its presentation, its imagination, and by virtue of that, who the dancer is who practices that form is automatically already predetermined. And it of course doesn't help that then Bollywood uses that form in multiple kinds of ways and adds, I mean, the fact that it uses the form is not a problem, but it adds a value judgment to who this woman who then dances this form is, and we've had an entire sort of actually a genealogy of cinema that has used and appropriated Kathak, but maybe also given it a certain kind of turn and influenced the form back. So I'm not only saying that Kathak in the Kendras were producing an image and then exporting it to cinema, but cinema was exporting it right back to the classroom or to the stage. And so very often when I had at that point of time access to both these spaces, to Bharatnatyam dancing spaces and Kathak dancing spaces, I very quickly learned that everything that I was doing wrong in one class was actually the other. And so if I was doing Bharatnatyam not correctly, then I was dancing Kathak, and if I was not dancing Kathak correctly, then I was doing Bharatnatyam. And and therefore I sort of inhabited this kind of great confusion for, are we really in an oppositional relationship? Meaning, what a successful political ideological project, right? That was really always the point of pitting it like that these are opposite civilizational forces, and that they cannot be in dialogue with each other at all. I think I was very sensitive to that kind of problem, and of course in disagreement with how both sides looked at both sides. And I think when then I really came to a stage when I said, okay, this is my body, this is my grammar, whatever form I've received, because I've dabbled in this, that and the other, in that restlessness, and now my body is going to do a little bit of whatever that is. And because Kathak didn't offer me storytelling in my hands, I feel like I borrowed that a little bit from my time in Bharatnatyam. And then I was left with the question of, well, what am I dancing about? Because my grammar doesn't train me. It doesn't train me to tell something at all. And I couldn't dance the repertoire that I learned. It was so far away from who I was, who I wanted to be, from the stories that I understood, or like they felt like they were truly mine. So they had to go. Even if I wanted the grammar to leave, that's the thing about dancing something for 20 years, no? It just doesn't leave you like that. Then really came the question of what is the word? Because this form felt like it, at least from where I learned it and how I inherited it, it was so intertwined with the word somehow. And then I had to start asking, what is the word then? What are these words that I'm dancing? To then find like a whole arena of poetry, which was very different from what I was dancing to, from dancing Krishna to maybe dancing Kabir, which was, today sounds like it was the most easily available shift, and that maybe Kabir is available today or is disseminated in multiple ways that you can access it. But I think back then when I'm probably talking about 10 years ago, when I was looking for that language, and when I found it, it felt like, okay, I can dance. I can dance again. I recently was going through some Facebook post or some very casual piece of writing somewhere that said #Ahmedabad Gharana, okay, which is a new bid to say Ahmedabad dance is a particular version of Kathak. And I just may be in agreement with it. And my agreement is that what Ahmedabad has ultimately done today, or the Gharana has done, is that it has rid Kathak of any Islamic aesthetic that there was to set on it. It has rid it of course, the language. it's rid of its poetry, but all in the name of actually producing a sophisticated upper class aesthetic, which is spectacular, low grade, warm lights, spectacular lines that are never, meaning the 45 degrees are perfect, they're never out of place. There are ombres of costumes, quite English, the colors. You know, there is a definitive aesthetic that's been produced in the last 20 years. And I'm not sure whether that aesthetic is coming from a advancement or finding a contemporary moment in Kathak. I do not think that's where, I think it comes from an anxiety with what our relationship while we live in Gujarat with anything that has ties to something that is overtly Muslim looks like. And so even when I continue to stay amazed when I sometimes these days still see the angarkha on a Kathak dancing body, you know, that's fast disappearing also. Forget like the Jhumar, Pasa, and meaning if we have to, meaning there are other gharanas in the country, no? The Jaipur gharana got rid of it long time ago. The Janki Prasad gharana got rid of it. The Jaipur gharana began without it. Meaning, so that process of really bringing the dance form into the fold began early on. Meaning, I know there are other ways of telling the same or doing this historiography and saying, you know, but where were the beginnings? Maybe the beginnings were not in this, and that was a later influence. I mean, that is a way of reading that history. But I think the present is loaded with an active aestheticization of the form. And then what does it mean for me to continue to practice? I feel like sometimes it's become so symbolic. The symbol of the dancer has become so provocative, and that I sometimes take solace in just the image of that dancer. And you know, like for example, recently I worked on a piece called Dar Firaq-e Gujarat, which was really, it's a very well-known poem written by someone called Wali Gujarati, who's known as actually the father of early Urdu language. And Wali's tombstone was in Ahmedabad, in the middle of a really, really busy road. And in 2002, when this kind of large-scale violence against Muslim people broke out in Gujarat, it was demolished and a tar road was built overnight. And this was in 2002 and we're in 2022, so we're 20 years from that point today. And it's now, there's a divider on that road, and it's so seamless, you can't tell that there used to be a full dargah right there that was an active shrine that people visited. And so I made this piece that's actually me walking from one end of that divider through to the other end of the divider. And the first time I was doing it, I had a camera in my hand. I was really walking the divider for the first time, and I walked to the end, and I walked to the spot where the dargah was, and what I found was still there are dried flowers, dried roses. So someone remembers that there used to be a dargah. But I had to do this walk in my costume. I can't let go that costume for some reason, even though it seems like now that this is a walk, and it's not a dance, but I still have to walk in my costume to know that I walk in the capacity of the dancer. to that targa which is non-existent. For me, that those two connections are not incidental. It is something that dance can do. It has the foundation to be able to do some of those things or ask some of those questions.
I just want to say wow. I feel like I've been saying wow after every video, but like on mute. It feels really precious to get such a generous insight into what everyone is working with, and their knowledge actually as well. That's come from what they're working with. I'm going to maybe start us off with some prompts of things that came up for me over Sandra and Avni's videos. I think one thing that I didn't notice when I was watching them individually, but watching them again together, I'm seeing them both talk about the power of dance and actually what dancing body, a dancing trained body can, the power it has to communicate certain things. And yeah, this last image that Avni left us with feels really powerful, of like suddenly what becomes when she does the walk in her costume and the power that that has to communicate something. And also Sandra was talking about, when she was talking about her relationship to dance and Indian classical dance, I thought it was quite an interesting relationship to name, where she says, I mean, I'm paraphrasing my own words, but she's saying that, you know, she's received a skill, her body is skilled thanks to the dance forms, and she now works with that skill to communicate what she wants to communicate. So just felt like really wonderfully clear examples of relationships with dance, and also quite like optimistic actually.
Yeah, to me also they felt like two practices that were not bound by the discipline that we've been talking about, but that both of them somehow, in, of course, very different ways and two very different forms, use dance as a kind of visibilizing force, which is what Avni says also, where the dancing body can actually become invisible, but dance makes something else visible. And I find that really actually quite exciting as a proposition. Also referring to Sandra's question of privilege and power, how does dance become a kind of tool or a vehicle to make privilege and power, your own also, visible, is something that I got out of both of them, actually seeing both of them together just now. And one other thing that came up for me, which also is something that I have been thinking about with my own work, is the question of access. I think for both of them, for both of their works, they've been, Sandra talks about this need to get out of the theater, to be able to access or create access into her work with several kinds of people, several kinds of different kinds of people, diverse audiences. And I think with Avni's work also, it's work that very often sits in the public space and is being accessed by passers-by, you know, and they aren't sort of just this quest for non-exclusive spaces, something that for me is also something that I'm kind of beginning to think about. If I don't place my work in the theater, where does it sit? And with each work, I kind of ask myself this question again and again, even though the market will want to fit you back into black boxes in theaters, but how do you continue to formulate work that that actually wants to keep stepping out?
Yeah, and if if anyone's not clicked on the link, I would really recommend you do the link of Jab Pyar Kiya To Darna Kya, this performance of Avni's outside in front of the graffiti that she was talking about, that is warning Hindu girls of the dangers of love jihad. Wow, like watching that clip, I was like, what felt really powerful was we're getting the whole story of like what she's doing, what she's trying to communicate, the politics of what she's doing, but also seeing like the average Joe standing and watching her performance, and like the sense of like surrender to interpretation and surrender to how your work is being received, and on whatever level of interpretation is being received. Like I'm just wondering, like how much of that is, how much of what she's trying to communicate is being like how much of that is legible to these people? A lot of them like working class men who are, you know, I immediately felt a bit like, whoa, are they like kind of taking this as a Bollywood performance of a woman sort of like performing sensuality? What's happening, like what's happening in this space of audience?
I remember having a conversation with Avni, and I think Avni is here as one of the participants. So I'm speaking for you, Avni. But I remember her saying that when she actually planned this work, she'd gone there with a kind of professional camera person who was going to, you know, videograph it quite neatly and then make, you know, do a kind of edit to put it out. And before that could happen, I think the video had gone viral, because somebody else had taken it and put it on YouTube, and the work was done by someone else, and then they never edited the work again because they didn't feel the need to, because the work had already taken its own form.
And it's interesting thinking about it in the sense of, yeah, like surrendering to what is just happening as you're, maybe before you're even ready to carve and frame what you want to frame, and how that relates back to, you know, how what we were saying about autonomy and control in our practices and in our rituals. And I feel like it sort of turned that on its head, because this is also a place where your autonomy, what's happening to her autonomy here as an artist. And I love that it's added so much complexity to that discussion of autonomy. Yeah. Also, again, like I'm seeing like a new link here between Sandra's work and Avni's work, which is again about this putting something out there and then letting it be, and just like living in that liveness of that movement, whatever that is. And this idea of kind of like bringing smells into the auditorium, that each person has a really visceral, like personal interpretation and connotation with, and sort of letting that waft. And I'm just imagining the sort of smells in the auditorium, and sort of the lack of control and autonomy that you have with bringing something like that into the space, in contrast to, like, you know, the autonomy we maybe have in the movement to say what we want it to say.
I'm thinking a lot about how both, in fact, all of you, the thing I seem to be relating to again and again is this sort of inhabiting of paradox continuously, sort of constantly in an oscillation between one thing and another. I mean, Avni was talking about it even between Kathak and Bharatnatyam, this sort of paradoxical, you're neither one thing or another, you're sort of both, and it's the both and of things. And I'm just really resonating with that. Like, it's like going to be my huge takeaway, I think, of how that beautiful that space is in some way. I mean, difficult, troubling. It's like having to stay in that troubled space and not avoid the paradox. Feels, yeah, something very truthful, if I want to say the word. Suddenly I've said it and then I'm like, what do you mean by truthful? But I'll leave it hanging in the space.
Yeah, and I think this truthful, I also sensed from this question that came up about, I only dance when I feel really compelled to dance. that I'm it's almost like my body's called into action, and I resonate with that kind of urgency, and I feel like that's a thing of value, especially when we have some, I wouldn't even call it privilege, because actually really it isn't, but it could be used as privilege, is the privilege of not having support structures sometimes, where you have funding applications and then responding to them with work, and then going into this sort of cycle of production and dissemination. If we don't have that kind of a pressure, which we many of us functioning in this part of the world don't, then you really sort of make choices about when it becomes urgent for you to make something. And I think about making work also like that I sort of give it about, sometimes it can be 3-4 years before something comes up for me or gets fully formulated. Or that it in the sort of thinking through or making of the work, I sometimes take 3-4 years, and I find that actually can somehow be a pleasurable space, even though it is minus the resources. But yeah, I just wanted to sort of set up that that question of not having support sometimes can actually be, I've very often found that to be a restful place also, that you don't have the urgency to make unless you have something to say, unless you're being compelled to move. Yeah.
It's a tricky one though, isn't it? Hearing you speak, that makes me sort of think, oh, wow, amazing. And I don't know many artists in London that would feel they have that kind of space in their lives to not keep producing, even if they have to produce, or if they have to go and produce some other work. Like there's a sort of continual need to labor that that doesn't afford that kind of space to develop thinking. And so yeah, and yeah, you were right to bring up the word privilege in that as well. Yeah, very different contexts, different flips of that coin, privilege.
Well, I mean, there are plenty of Bharatnatyam dancers in the UK that don't do it professionally, in the sense that they have a 9-to-5 day job and they will work with Bharatnatyam in the time that they have off from their day job. And it's a complicated question, because on one hand, those of us who are freelancing full-time want to advocate for being an artist full-time, and yeah, and all of that. But also there's a paradox there, because yeah, when you do it in the capacity that you have, where it's not about earning money and it's not a commodity that you're trading, it does free up a lot of things, frees up a lot of pressures, like both in terms of what to make, what you have to make, and when you want to make it. So it is like definitely a question that's pretty live, I think, with the Indian dance community, as many of us, yeah, a large proportion of the practitioners here are doctors, lawyers, and everything else day to day. And they find that actually that takes away the anxiety of and the precarity, etc., of what they're doing. I also want to kind of like cycle back. I feel like my role in this is always just like come back into something orbits. But I am also thinking about what Avni was saying about how the aesthetics of Kathak is changing in a specific part of Gujarat, or a specific Gharana, or Gharana to be. And I thought it was interesting that she marked the difference between the kind of, so the aesthetics changing, which she kind of named as maybe an Englishization of the costumes and the kind of minimalism of the presentation of the dance and the stripping of its Islamic influences. She said, well, is that just something changing because it's existing now and it's changing through time and contemporization, or is that something that's changing for an agenda that wants to deny history or strip something from it? Like, what is the agenda? Like, why is that change actually happening? Is there an agenda behind it? And I feel like that's really interesting. Yeah, it's just I find it really interesting because I think it brings us back to this idea of like, for whom, in service of what, rather, in service of what is this happening? But also it opens up the question of, maybe that's fine for it to happen if it's happening in some sort of organic way for you and your circumstances, but maybe not, maybe that's not why it's happening.
As we continue to chat, shall we open up to questions? Because I think I realize that we have about 20 minutes left now. And if we can open up some questions as we continue to speak, we can also keep collecting some questions. I just wanted to also bring up the question of why, for me, Avni's contribution is also quite an important one, given the socio-political climate we're in, is that this sort of invisibilization of Islam that we're seeing in sort of rewriting of textbooks, renaming of streets, renaming of cities. There's a whole sort of project at play. And of course, with dance, it started decades ago. It started, almost a century ago. But then this work for me becomes a very important one in this given climate, because then that dancer's body that Avni is referring to becomes a highly political body, because it's going to remind you of erasures that are currently at play, and it's going to be visible when it is being made to be invisible. So yeah, it's just one of those things that I kind of we all seem to be dealing with quite a bit here in India, and I feel like the work responds to that quite directly and actually quite poetically.
I guess it would be good to ask this question and address, maybe now, maybe later, but at some point before we end. I'm interested, Mandeep, in how or what maybe has shifted for you in your thinking and your practice over the course of our event, our like contributions, our discussions. And yeah, I'm thinking about it too as well, but it would be interesting to identify some things that are shifting.
I can definitely say something that is a few things that have stuck with me. One is most certainly the question of rest, of repose, and a stripping away of anxiety. Is something that I'm kind of resonating with, because I think somehow in being caught up with formulating works and making them very clear and being able to sort of figuring out for yourself why you're making this work and who is it for and all of that, invariably there is anxiety in that process. And just hearing some of the contributors today, I feel that there is value to the question of repose. How does one return to that place of emptiness, where those ideas that you've built up have sort of fallen flat, and then you're having to sort of start again with nothing, and then make some decisions again. And I'm kind of resonating with that value right now. Yeah, that's one of the things that's sort of coming up for me from today.
But you, Shivaangee.
I think I'm thinking about this idea of like what is visible, or what we make visible when we dance, and how I think up till now I've been really preoccupied with the kind of question of like Orientalist gaze, and yeah, it's always kind of frustrated by how I'm seen in this context, and how that's disempowering. And I feel like after hearing from everyone, it's sort of made that question a bit more alive and a bit more full of possibility again of, okay, and what am I making visible through the privilege of dance and a dancing body, and yeah, the gravity that comes with being the gravity that comes with being costumed and in mode of performance and liveness, and that vulnerability, what else becomes visibilized, and how can I enjoy that visibilizing to say what I want to say, despite and alongside all the other types of gaze that might be happening as well.
It's interesting when you speak of the gaze, because as you were speaking of that, I had been, in response to what Mandeep was saying, I've been thinking a lot about what Avni had talked about the grammar that inhabits the body. And I was kind of running with this idea of the grammar in the body, and how much you can't let go of it. It's always there. So each one of us has a sort of grammar of the body that is partly learned and partly somehow conditioned, inherited, whatever. And how a lot of this feels like it's when I was listening to Mandeep and the sort of stripping of anxiety and bringing rest, and I was thinking, well, what if rest is if we can practice rest as a kind of grammar, like how do we kind of make these kind of inherent in our sort of being, in our body's archive. But then, as you were speaking about the gaze, I was also thinking about very much as a sort of relational thing. So not only a grammar of our body, but the grammar of how we even see. So how I even, the way I can shift how I see. And it made me think as well of this sort of creation of new grammars, particularly with Sandra talking about this, the responding to smell as a sort of way to infiltrate a formal dance, and how I was really curious about her methodology. I don't know if I completely understood it, but there was something like that I sort of recognized that it was not, it maintained some sort of dance grammar within this sort of relationship to how the body responds to smell, and I was really curious about that. Yeah, and sort of, I suppose as someone who hasn't got the same training as you, I'm sort of taking on a lot of this information and applying it into sort of wider generalizations, but I don't think that's, I'm not doing that necessarily in saying that everything's the same, but I'm just sort of saying, well, what's the sort of applicable learning about how we see bodies and how we operate as articulations, and the body is constantly as speaking, you know, even in its not vocal speaking, but the bodies are always in some kind of active speech in how it's in relation to.
I'm also thinking about permission and autonomy, and feel like it's kind of like moved this way and also this way. So I've like straddled more ground forwards and backwards, but like I feel empowered when I think about sort of Mandeep, when you were talking about querying the artifact and hallucinating a dance form. I'm paraphrasing, but kind of thinking about the choices that we're making at every point as speculations on the kind of thing we want to build, as choices towards an ideal construction, feels really empowering to then be like, okay, yeah, I'm not reconstructing, I'm fully aware that I'm constructing, I'm going to own that, and I'm going to construct speculatively with an idea of a speculative future ahead. So that feels like really permissive, and really like it gives me a lot of permission. And then also I'm like thinking about, well, you know, all the conversation and acknowledgements around the erasure that is ongoing, and who gets to be visible and who doesn't get to be visible. And, you know, still this heaviness around, I don't really engage with that erasure in my practice and in my relationship with Bharatnatyam. It's just not very present for me. And yeah, that feels like a step back this way to be like, well, should I have permission? And there's lots of questions around that. So yeah, I feel like I've just like straddled more distance rather than going anywhere. But it feels useful to like have more things as reference points.
And hearing you, Shivaangee, I've also sort of thought about, in our conversations, thought about what seems so important to me. I can see that there are things that are important to you that are different from what is important to me because of the context within which you practice. And I remember the first conversation we had when you said, you know, you love the idea of a ritual, the fact that you can get into a form every day. And I remember being slightly alarmed by that, because I feel like it sort of consolidates something for me. And then I realized when I see this Arwood practice happen at independent dance, and I'm thinking that actually this is a kind of process of visibilization also at one level that doesn't happen very often in dance spaces in London. I remember really craving diverse inputs at Laban at that time, thinking, you know, why are we learning only certain kinds of movement vocabularies. So I know that tension is still alive in your context, and I recognize it and I resonate with it, and I know that my responses are only coming from my context. And I don't know whether we have, I think I can take a couple of minutes, but I would really like to read a paragraph by Nritya from an article, the link of which I'll just share, which is called, so Nritya Pillai writes in an article titled Recasting the Bharatnatyam narrative, the narrative of Bharatnatyam. And I'm just going to read a paragraph where she says, recently, the phrase decolonizing Indian dance has become popular on social media and even in some academic, pseudo-academic discourse. Much of the aim of such work is to actually shift attention away from the power of caste elites in shaping both the social reform movement against hereditary performers and in the engineering of modern Bharatnatyam. The concept of decolonization, as many of us know, has been appropriated by even the radical right in places like India, a kind of rhetorical strategy that Bhakti Sringarpur calls fake decolonization. To be clear, Devdasi reform was a project of elite Indian nationalists, and the reinvention of Indian dance was also a Brahminic nationalist project from its very beginning. Neither of these historical processes were projects of the colonial state. When statements are made like the British banned Devdasis or the British suppressed the Nautch so that it had to be rescued, the burden of blame is transferred from Brahmin nationalist elites who actualize these projects to the straw man of colonialism. The Brahmin dancers who use terms like decolonizing Indian dance work to other everyone except themselves, for they must remain, even in our woke times, the stewards and legitimate inheritors of the practice and history of Bharatnatyam. Yeah, I just feel like it's really important to look at use of terminology from several perspectives and from lenses that are not ours, to be able to know how each of these constructs can actually can easily be problematized. And I find that actually, in being able to read your practice, I feel like it problematizes something in my practice, and being able to read Nritya, I feel like there is a kind of problematization of certain usages and very easy usages like decolonization. Yeah, I just wanted to put it out there to sort of continue complicating the conversation.
Thanks for sharing that excerpt, Mandeep. It's a really powerful piece of writing that you're reading from, and I think we've shared it as well in the chat box. So really encourage people to click through and have a read. And I feel glad that we can end on a note that's about recomplicating, recomplicating, no, complicate, I don't know. That feels like a good place, a good tone with which to end.
The complications. Yeah, shall we, well, did you have anything more you wanted to say, Mandeep, or should we, otherwise I
think it's a wrap.
Is it a wrap? So if that's a wrap, I would just love to say how amazing, I've just had such a fantastic time, both today and in our previous conversation, speaking with you both. Thank you so much for your kind of fantastically, as I said, transparent and articulate, brilliantly articulate way of presenting the problems and the trouble, really, and sort of staying with the trouble and not being afraid of it. Again, I will really take away with this sort of idea of the paradoxical. I'm sort of really enjoying in the day. And yeah, it's one last thing to also say before we close is that for those of you who joined late, this whole event has been recorded and it's going to be archived on ID's digital library. I can put it won't be there obviously yet. It will be there maybe in a few weeks' time. But do look out for it if you missed any bits. We will also have each person's in the chat here, each person's video, provocation video will also be there. So it will be a sort of library page with an edit of this conversation and then 4 videos and then lots of links. So you can sort of rummage back in, and I will probably be re-listening to it because it's been so much covered in the conversation. I was going to put us in touch with the Adavu practice room, but it actually looks like they're cooling down, so it might not be as great as an audio to finish with, but maybe I'll let both of you say bye-bye, and I want to say thank you so much again, Mandeep and Shivaangee, and the 4 contributors as well, for an amazingly rich, insightful journey.
Yeah, thank
And
you.
it went fast.
Yeah, 4 hours.
Yeah, I thought 4 hours would crawl, but they didn't.
Yeah, thank you, Henny, for inviting this dialogue between us and giving us so much autonomy in the process. I think that's been really great to just sort of drive it forwards with our own intentions and be supported by you and ID. That's felt really, really great.
And thank you also to the audience members to actually, some of them stuck through 4 hours. And it's not easy, especially in the online space, to be there for such long hours. But yeah, really appreciate that kind of focus. Thank you.
And yeah, thank you also to Claude, who's sitting with me doing all the tech. Thank you, Claude. Seamless tech day.
Agrawal team, my God, they've been at it for 4 hours.
Yeah, sweating away in the cold. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for the Adavu team. Oh, look, they're having a rest now. It's been great.
Lovely.
It's been so great to have you in the building.
Shavasana on the event. Great. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.